So my story initially starts with me, an 18-year-old female, being a guitar player of 6 years. I started early in high school and loved to play. My guitar teacher was super chill and awesome, but he was no longer able to teach me as he was moving away. I felt like I still wanted to move forward with my learning, so I decided to look up other available guitar teachers nearby. I didn't have a driver's license back then, and my guitar case was too heavy for me to be traveling long distances for a couple of lessons a week. I find this one guitar instructor who lived surprisingly close, 4 or 5 streets down. We contacted, and he agreed to teach me. To give you guys a bit of an idea about this guy, he was a tall, slim, white guy. Even though he looked a tad on the scrappy side, you could definitely tell that he was strong. He would also mention how he did lots of outdoor sports. He looked to be around his early 40s, but I'm pretty sure he was actually in his mid-30s. He had these big, pale blue eyes, sunken cheeks, and was balding, had a shaved head. So yes, in retrospect, he did look rather disturbing, but I didn't want to go and judge a guy by looks at first encounter. On the first lesson, I went to his place with my guitar, but after seeing me play, he told me he couldn't teach me because he only taught beginners, even though I told him that I had played for 6 years. So for the rest of the time, we just jammed and chilled, and then I left. The next day, I got a text from him saying that he had an old guitar book he wasn't using and wanted to give to me. Earlier that day, I had a huge fight with my sister, so I was eager to get out of the house for a breather anyway. I met him at a halfway point to receive the book from him. After doing so, I said my goodbyes, but as I was leaving, he started to follow me. I was sort of confused at this point, but he just casually held conversation, so I just chatted with him on my way home. We got to my place. I dropped off the book, we played guitar together for a bit and hung out. Suddenly, he started talking to me about a waterfall near his place. I was confused because I'd never heard of this place. Why would there be a waterfall nearby? I live in an urban neighborhood. He was super shocked that I hadn't seen it and insisted that we go. It's only 10 minutes away, I promise. My stupid, naive ass agreed because he promised it was super close. So we headed out to this so-called waterfall. This is where shit went downhill. As we were walking to the waterfall, the conversation started to change. He asked what nationality I am, so I told him that I'm Korean. Suddenly, he hugged me super hard, saying, "I love Koreans." I was bewildered at this point, but I awkwardly let it pass. He started talking about himself and how he dropped out of high school early because he had violent tendencies. He said he threw tables at his teachers and threatened kids. I let him talk, but inside started to feel extremely uncomfortable. I was constantly checking around the street, but found there wasn't a single person to be seen. He continued to ask me uncomfortable things, like if I was a virgin, and how he liked to think about classical pieces in his mind while he had sex. I wish I was lying about that, but I'm not. At one point, he picked up a flower and tried to put it in my hair. I declined and pulled away from him. He told me that he liked flowers because he can preserve their beauty even after death. Now at this point, I'm shitting myself. My heart was pounding. I was terrified, but I didn't know how to tell him that I didn't want to go to this waterfall. It's been 20 minutes at this point, and no such place has been seen. I constantly asked him where the waterfall was, but he brushed it off, saying, "We're almost there." Eventually, after about 30 minutes of walking, we got to a random bush track. I'm beyond uncomfortable at this point, and my mind is racing for any excuse not to go in. I suddenly spotted a guy coming out of the bush track, and let me tell you, I couldn't have been more relieved to finally see another human being. I sent the guy a huge, pleading look, and he seemed perplexed. He glanced over at my guitar teacher, but didn't say anything and left. My heart sank. Now let me tell you, the guy actually wasn't lying about the waterfall. It really did exist. But who gives a shit at this point, right? I'm alone in a place I'm not familiar with a guy who is saying some really scary things. I let him walk ahead whilst behind my back I began texting my older sisters to call me ASAP. My phone rang, so I answered the call. My sister is on the line like, "What the fuck is going on? Are you still with that guy? Where are you?" I just faked a wobbly smile and answered, "Hey, what's up?" "What? You want me to come home right now? It's an emergency." Okay. Meanwhile, the guitar dude is watching me carefully. I told him I need to leave, and suddenly his facial expression changed. "Why?" he said in a low, intimidating way. His demeanor did a 180, no longer smiling. "Why do you have to do as your sister tells you?" His big, pale eyes were unblinking. I kept insisting that it was an emergency, but he was not budging one bit. He started demanding that the waterfall is literally right there, and we're so close. At this point, the bush track that we had walked was sloped downward. I was wearing a pair of boots at the time, but was constantly slipping as we ventured down. It had dawned on me that even if I were to run, it was most likely that I would either slip or he would catch up to me very easily. Inside, I'm freaking out like crazy because I honestly have no idea how to get back. So eventually I decide the best thing to do is just agree and get this over with. I weakly agree that we can go and see this godforsaken waterfall only for 5 minutes max, then I need to leave. He suddenly changed back to all cheery again, and he was leading me again down to the waterfall. By now I have thoughts that I might actually die here. If he were to harm me in any way, there would be no one to hear my cries. So when he wasn't looking, I started taking pictures of my surroundings. Random part of the bush track, some distinct rocks. Because my thoughts were, if I were to get murdered here, then maybe, just maybe, the police might find this phone and trace it to me. There are no words to truly express that feeling of, I am going to be murdered. If anything were to happen, would my family be able to find me? No one would ever suspect to look at a place like this. By this time, the sky was getting dark, and the guitar guy insisted on making a fire near the waterfall. I just agreed. He made a small fire, and we just sat in silence, staring at the flames for a bit. I heard a small sigh beside me, but continued to stare at the fire. After about the third sigh, I glanced over at him. He was staring straight at me with his huge, unblinking eyes, the flames making a disturbing shadow over his smiling face. He stayed like that for a solid 15 seconds. He began to scoot over closer and asked if he could give me a massage. I told him no. He then asked if I was cold and tried to cuddle me. So I stood up and said 5 minutes was up, and I needed to leave. He seemed satisfied that we did spend some time at the waterfall, so he agreed to take me home. The whole time back, he was constantly nudging me and asking me why I was so quiet. I was beyond too traumatized to answer. He forced his arm in mine, and we linked arms all the way home. It suddenly started to rain, and he just paused and forced me to face him. He asked me if he could kiss me. For once, I looked him straight in the eyes and said no. He seemed offended and asked why not. It's just a kiss. It doesn't mean anything. I told him no again, and he let it go. We're almost at my house, finally, before he stopped and said, "Well, this is yours." For a second I was confused, but realized he mistook my house for a couple blocks down. I just nodded and said goodbye to him. I walked in the driveway to the front door, waited until he was definitely gone, before I bolted out and all the way home. My sister answered the door, furious and demanding what the hell had happened and why I didn't answer her 50 missed calls. I didn't even have the energy to say anything. I just went upstairs to the bathroom, took a scathingly hot shower, and scrubbed my body clean 3 times. I know this story is extremely long, but trust me, this wasn't even all the creepy shit this guy said to me. He continued to send me messages and call me, but I ignored him. He began to grow angry and demanded for his book back. I eventually told one of my friends, who was mortified at what happened. She said to just ignore all his calls. I did have little comfort in the fact that he thought I lived a couple houses down, but was terrified every time the doorbell rang, as I pictured one of my family members answering it to find him at the door with a knife to kill us all. My friend had insisted on going to the cops, but what was the point? I was 18, and technically he didn't do anything illegal. After I blocked his number, that was the last I'd ever hear from him. It took me another 5 years to recover from the trauma, though never completely.
Something followed my friend and I through the woods. So this happened years ago while I was still in high school. I'm now 23 and have never shared this story anywhere, and only ever with a select few in person. I live in Missouri, just north of Kansas City. One night my buddy and I snuck out of my parents' house to go smoke. There was a trail that was right by my house and a local elementary school. Never really seen anything out there outside of deer, foxes, coyotes, etc. But growing up we heard from parents and other families that the woods nearby were haunted. The area we lived in was right near an old slave farm, and I never gave it much thought. Being a kid who, yes, believes in Bigfoot, but has never seen any true proof, so I'm still pretty skeptical of stories. Anyways, back to my story. After we snuck out, we made it to the trail. On one side of it there was the back of the house, and on the other side was woods. As we were walking down the trail, it felt like any other time we had done it. For the first 3/4 of the trail, everything was fine. But as we came up to the final bend, my friend slapped me on the arm and pointed into the woods and asked if I had just saw that. I looked into the woods and saw nothing, so I blew it off and thought he was just out of it. So I kept walking like everything was fine while he still had his eyes glued to the woods. At the final stretch, about 50 yards, all canopied over, he slapped my arm again and stopped me. This time with force, so I looked over thinking it was still nothing. I saw a figure of something similar to a human shape, but standing about 8 feet high. The reason I saw it was since the trees by it were shaking. At this point, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but I was scared nonetheless. I said that we should keep moving, and we did. But now I too had my eyes glued on whatever it was in the woods. We picked up our pace to a speed walk, and after about 10 steps or so, the thing started to move as well, but on a path that would put it on the trail in front of us before the end. At that point, we looked at each other and immediately started running, like running as fast as we could. We made it to the end of the trail and cut up through someone's yard and into the street. Once there, I looked back toward the trail and saw that the figure was standing on the edge of it. After that, we went back to my house and talked about what had just happened. As a couple of notes, I'm sorry if my story is kind of a run-on. Like I said, this was the first time I've ever shared it anywhere. Also, there haven't been any bear sightings up by my area, but we have had some bobcats and some cougars. Not sure what it was. I don't think it was a Bigfoot, but if it was human, then it had to be some 8-foot tall guy in the woods behind my neighborhood at 2 a.m. This happened when I was around 9 or 10. I was staying the night at my friend Catherine's for the first time. We met the summer before and were inseparable ever since. Kat lived in this old 2-story house surrounded by woods and dirt road. The house itself gave me an uneasy feeling when I first saw it. The shutters were falling off. The paint on the house seemed to be fading. It was an old piece of crap now that I think about it, but at the time I was nervous and excited. I remember walking in after I stared at the house for what seemed like 20 minutes. Surprisingly, the inside was a lot nicer than the outside, so I pushed that uneasy feeling down and just shrugged it off as nerves. I remember the smell of the house. I can't pinpoint it, but it was different, like walking into a musty room. I started to walk around, just to explore my surroundings, but I noticed Kat's mom watching me. I simply smiled and waved, but she just stood there staring at me wide-eyed. I've never met her before, but why was she looking at me like that? Suddenly, Kat flew around the corner and tackled me. We both fell and started to giggle. I noticed Kat's mom out of the corner of my eye start to turn around and walk off. She was gone, just like that. Fast forward a couple hours. Kat and I are laying on a beanbag in her room watching Children of the Corn, which, by the way, was one of my favorite movies at the time. I grew up watching horror movies, mostly Stephen King or any movie my mom was watching. Not her decision, mine, because I love the feeling that a good horror movie gives you. She felt the same way, and that's why we clicked so much. Back to the story. We were sitting here watching this movie, and suddenly the door opposite us slams closed. We both jumped, giggled, and brushed it off because, well, we were kids. Until the second time, when it creaked open and slammed again, not even seconds after the first time. Now I'm sitting there staring at this door, trying to figure out how in the hell it's opening and closing by itself. In the midst of all that, the only other person in this house is her mom, who I figured out earlier was just a tad bit creepy. "You think it's just your mom?" I asked her, but she shook her head. "You sure?" I asked again, but she said something that gave me chills, and still gives me chills, just telling this story. "My mom isn't home, it's just me and you, silly." I just stare at her while she's staring at me, trying to wrap my head around what she had just told me. "Where is your mom?" I asked her. "She's at work." I giggled, thinking that she was just trying to trick me. "She is at work. She only works for a couple hours, so she leaves me here because she trusts me." At this point, I'm just looking at her, and she noticed this look of concern on my face. "What's wrong?" she asked. "If your mom is at work, then who was that lady looking at me earlier?" As I said this, we heard what seemed like footsteps at the time, but thinking about it now, it sounded like shuffling in one spot above us. I'm completely terrified at this point. Every hair on my neck is standing on end, and I just want to leave. I start to get up when Kat pulled me back down and asked me if I had heard the noise. I nodded. It was silent again until the footsteps were back, but louder and faster. We both gazed up at the ceiling and she grabbed my hand. "This happens every day," she whispered. I look over at her and can truly see the fear on her face. The footsteps stopped and she looked at me, her face flushed white. "Is there an attic?" I asked. She pointed up toward the ceiling. "Well, maybe it's just squirrels or birds," I kept thinking over and over. "You ever notice when you're really quiet? That's when you can hear almost everything around you. Imagine if you're sitting in a house with your best friend alone at 10 years old and you hear the giggle of a 3-year-old child. Mind you, she has no younger brothers or sisters. We were completely alone. Kat was just as scared as I was. I remember thinking that I just wanted to get out of the house. Just grab her and run out the door. At least we would feel safer and less scared outside than we would in. "Want to hear a story?" Kat asked, pulling my mind back to reality. I nodded. "Well, this house used to be a daycare. There was this lady that would watch the kids, and one day she just locked them in the attic and then hung herself from a rope in the kitchen. They all died because the kids were hungry and thirsty and no one found them for months. In this house." My heart started to pound. My eyes were wide with fear. "It's true," she said. "I've seen them, the little kids, every day. But I never saw the lady, but you have. Earlier." After she told me this, I don't remember much else aside from running out the door of her room and making it outside that house. Kat followed, begging me to stay, but I just had to leave. My stomach felt like it was in knots. I felt like I had walked into a horror movie myself, and just wished that this day had never happened. Fast forward to years later. That was the last day that I had seen or heard from Kat. I remember her always coming to play outside at my dad's during the day. I remembered what she looked like. I remembered meeting her parents and seeing them out in public. I'm now 27, and I can't seem to find any proof that she even existed. All my friends that I was friends with then, I'm still friends with now, even after all these years. But why not her? I drove by that house maybe 15 times, and still wonder if maybe she was just one of the ones that never made it out. Creepy camping experience. So, last summer my then boyfriend, now fiancé, had planned a trip to go visit Hocking Hills, Ohio for a weekend to get away. We both love camping and being away from the craziness that is our lives. So we rented a really cool cabin. If you're familiar with the area, it's set way back, but it's 2 stories, full bathroom, kitchen, living room with TV, Wi-Fi, massage chairs, LOL, etc. And cannot forget the hot tub. So one evening, after a long day of hiking and then celebrating with drinking and eating, we decided to hop in the hot tub. It was getting dark, so we decided just a quick relaxation session and then right back to inside. About 5 minutes into us being in the hot tub, I heard a noise. The way most of the hot tubs sit is facing the woods. Like 3 sides are woods, then one side faces the cabin you stay in. So I heard a crack of a branch. And to my man, I kind of froze and looked at him. He laughed a little and said, must be a small animal. I let it go. But very shortly after, these noises started to get closer. And whatever it was started to make a weird crying noise. Kind of sounded like a dying coyote mixed with a snarling dog. It was so weird. It was far away at first, then it got closer and closer and closer. The only reason I knew I should worry was because my guy was not okay about it. Usually he's relaxed, cool, calm, and collected. It sounded like it went from the ground far away to being high up in a tree and right the fuck behind us on the ground. Whatever it was snapped a branch behind my right side. The door to inside was just 3 feet away from the hot tub, so my guy looked at me and quietly said, "Get the fuck inside." I know we were far set back in the woods. It's Hocking Hills. We're close enough to Athens to maybe run across bobcats. But it was so strange and odd. It was like whatever it was smarter than us and tried to sneak up on us. I'm sure it was an animal of some sort. But that was the first and only time that my fiancé has said that's the only phenomenon that I cannot rationally explain. It genuinely scared the absolute fuck out of him. Mostly just because of the sounds. We both grew up in rural areas for part of our lives, and I lived on a rural farm for a few years. And none of these noises were natural to either of us. If anyone has any opinions on what that creature could be, please let me know. The next day we had to check out, so as he was doing so, I decided to explore the little river that was about half a mile away from the checkout center. I videoed all of it because it was beautiful. But as I got closer to the water, there was a bark/growl that came from underneath a rocky area. I immediately booked it because, yeah, it was probably a giant-ass frog. But it scared me enough to just dip.
I live in England in a 2-story flat, and I have always believed in the paranormal. But my dad does not believe in any type of ghost or anything supernatural. I never thought that this flat was haunted. However, as I got older, I started to feel uncomfortable by myself, and I saw shadows downstairs out of the corner of my eye. Now, there is an attic directly above our second floor, but there is no way for us to enter it, as you cannot access it from this flat. The only way to access this attic is by having a specific key that can open the attic, as it is council flats, which is above my neighbor's house. However, the attic above my flat is the only one which is blocked off, and there is no way to enter it. I have the last flat on the end of these 18 council flats. There are no neighbors above us, just the attic, which no one can access without that key, and they would still not be able to get above our flat. One night about 2 years ago, all of the family was in bed, and it was about 3 in the morning. All of a sudden, I heard something crash above. It was so loud that it woke all my family members up, and we all got up and stood on the landing together. After that bang, we heard 3 loud footsteps, and the sound of something being dragged behind these footsteps. It was so scary, as we know that nobody can physically get up there. My dad was not convinced that it was a ghost. He thought that somebody had somehow gotten into the attic, so he went outside to check if the communal attic door was opened. I followed him outside, and it was completely padlocked shut with heavy chains around the lock. I tried to explain to him, how can there be anyone up in our part of the attic when it's blocked off and impossible to get into? We came back into the house, and we were all quite shaken up. My brother was young, and was able to get to sleep, but I was awake all night. After this experience, I started to smell old cigarette smoke every time I would enter my toilet, and it was so stale and stagnant. After the event, me, my brother, and my mom were going away on holiday, whilst my dad had to stay there and work. He told me he slept with his headphones in every night, as even he felt uncomfortable by himself. As a family, we still have no idea what those noises were, and since then we have heard many strange things. I'm a logical person, and I do consider myself a skeptic, even though I know what I saw, and I know that it really happened. Maybe it's just that I tend to be skeptical about most things. I will, as briefly as I can, describe a little history of the house and the changes my family made to it, because I believe that it applies to what I experienced. I'm originally from a small farming town in Washington State. My parents bought a ranch-style house in this town in the early 1980s, and we lived there until early 1993. The house was built in the mid-1950s, and was known as a party house in the 1970s when my parents were in high school. My parents did a lot of work on the house, as it was a little run down when they bought it. There were many holes punched in the walls and doors. The original hardwood floors were in rough shape, and the family room and original master bedroom had disgusting, torn, brown and lime green shag carpeting. The original master bedroom also had wood paneling on the walls. We tore out all the paneling and replaced the horrifying shag carpets with vinyl and new carpeting and renovated the bathrooms. The main change that my parents did to the house was they added a new master bedroom to the back of the house and converted the old master bedroom to a large laundry room / sewing and crafts room for my mom. The new master bedroom was added onto the other side of the master bedroom from the original master bedroom turned laundry room. I include all of this because during college, I mentioned what happened in this house to a friend of mine who was really into the paranormal, and he suggested that the renovations my parents did, in combination with it being a former party house where there had been drug use and possibly violence, had stirred something up. So one side of the house was set up as follows. from front to back. Family room, the new laundry room, the master bathroom, then the new master bedroom at the back. The kitchen was to the right of the family room if you were facing the door to the laundry room, and could be partially seen from the family room. Now to my experiences. The Void Man. I do not know how old I was when I first saw it, or how old I was when I last saw it. I lived in the house until just before my 8th birthday. I was between 5 and 7. That much I do know. I mostly saw it when I was in the family room. It would stand perfectly still in the doorway from the family room to the laundry room. It seemed to be staring at me, but it had no eyes. It was a pitch-black void in the shape of a human. There were no discernible facial or other body features on it. It was a body with a head on top. The outline of the body appeared to be slightly fuzzy or misty. I would say it was over 6 feet tall. I should also mention that no one who lived in the house was that tall. My mom was maybe 5'3", my dad is 5'7", and my brother was a toddler at this time, so it couldn't be me misremembering any of them. I would just stand there and stare back at it. I felt frozen and didn't know what to do or say. I felt like I couldn't speak if I wanted to when it was there. I remember feeling a sinking sensation when I saw it. I have one distinct memory of staring at it in the doorway to the laundry room, and I could see my mom working in the kitchen. She was standing at the stove and could have seen it if she had turned her head to her right. She did not notice it. I named it the Void Man at some point. Staring at it was like staring into a deep void, a void that would swallow me up. I don't remember feeling fear exactly when I saw the full shadow person. It was more that I couldn't feel anything. That was not the case for the other way that I would see it. It would like to peek its head around the door frames at me. It would do it several times in rapid succession. That would terrify me. I think that was its intention. I would usually go running off to my room or to go find my mom. I only ever saw the full body of the Void Man from the family room looking into the laundry room, but it would peek its head out at me from both of the laundry room doors, the one leading into the family room and the one leading into the master bathroom. If my parents ever saw anything, they had never mentioned it, and I have never mentioned it to them. I'm sure that there are those out there that will say, well, you were very young, you must be remembering wrong, or you made it up at some point and then it became real to you over time. I wish this was the case. I really do. But I remember the Void Man very vividly. I know that I saw this thing, whatever it was. We moved out of that house in 1993 and moved into one that we had built. I have never seen anything like what I did in that house ever again, but the experience has followed me my entire life. I have a nervousness about open doors, and what I might see on the other side.
We saw something we can't explain. About a year ago, I was out back with my family. It was around 8 and the sun was setting. We lived in a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. The closest neighbor was far away. Something down in the field kept catching my eye, but I ignored it at first. My sister saw it too and kept looking out towards the trees. She was getting freaked out by it. My mom said to go investigate, so me and my sister started to walk across the field towards the tree line. Big mistake. It's hard for me to describe. This was the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me. I didn't see it at first, and I didn't understand why my sister was so scared, until we were about 100 yards away, when I saw this creature. Tall, probably around 8 or 9 feet tall. White, humanoid, with an elongated head, and no face. It had long arms and peeked out around the trees. We stopped in our tracks. We couldn't tell what it was. It took a few steps further out of the trees and swayed back and forth at me like a praying mantis. Me and my sister ran screaming back to the house where my mom stood, jaw dropped. She saw it too. I have never been so scared in my life. We grabbed the binoculars and watched this terrifying creature peek in and out of the tree line, spying on us. My grandma thought we all had a wild imagination. The sun was almost gone now, and it was getting really dark, and the darker it got, the more the thing moved. Back and forth along the trees. It was terrifying, so we went in for the night and locked everything up tight. I couldn't sleep that night. I was hearing scratching on the roof, and at one point a very loud bang and various noises coming from the barn. I was very afraid that I would wake up to my animals missing. The next morning, my grandma asked if we had heard the loud bang outside that night. She ended up taking my grandpa with her on her morning walk. I have no idea what it was, and it haunts me to this day.
When I was around 15 or so, my mom and stepfather got divorced in a pretty dramatic way. It's like the whole household was just turned upside down. Everyone's routines were off. Mom was out doing something most nights after work. My little sister spent more time with her friends. And I became something of a night owl, usually waiting until the wee morning hours to lie down. Our house was a simple one in a rural area. 2 stories, with a huge backyard sharing a fence with a cow pasture and the entrance to some thick woods. The house had a lot of problems, but I enjoyed taking over the maintenance and gardening work as they gave me something to do when I was feeling depressed. For some perspective, our kitchen windows looked out directly to the fence described above. The left half of the fence bordered one of the back corners of the big cow pasture, while the right half bordered the entrance to the woods, which had a rather overgrown trailhead just barely visible from the kitchen window. For the most part, though, all you could see was overgrown grass and shrubbery, at least 4 or 5 feet high, and some low-hanging trees of mixed oak and cedar. This backdrop added a sort of eerie tranquility to our property, which I appreciated from the first day we moved in. One night, I took a break from my homework after realizing I had stayed up way too late on a Thursday, even for my standards. I went downstairs to make some food, and my dog followed me like she always did. I made a grilled cheese, and while I was at the sink cleaning the pan, I noticed some of the grass from the wood line start to shuffle around. It startled me at first, but as soon as I began to fixate on it, I saw no more disturbance. We lived in wildlife country at the time, so I figured it was probably a deer, coyote, or a cougar. Unsurprising for the latter, given that the farmer who owned the pasture had dozens of cows and sometimes didn't bring them in at night. Strangely, though, I noticed this for several more nights, always when I was doing the dishes after eating. I would look out the window, see the grass shuffle around, then see nothing further when I fixated on the spot. I was always a fan of scary movies, and I tended to be a jumpy kid, so each time I convinced myself I wasn't really seeing any sort of pattern. This changed, though, when my dog would start fixating on the woods herself and barking at night. Furthermore, our motion sensor security light would begin to stay activated sometimes for hours on end, only switching off when I would get to the kitchen to make my midnight snacks. Eventually, I told my mom about all this, and while she initially seemed concerned, she pointed out that we did live behind the woods after all, and so we should expect animals or occasional homeless squatters near our property. She said that if I was concerned, I could always call the police or animal control. I didn't disagree, and for the most part gave the matter no further thought. One night, though, I decided that a 1 a.m. dip in our hot tub in the backyard sounded good. I changed, and my dog and I went outside. I climbed in, closed my eyes, and zoned out like usual. I was whipped awake when I heard a loud crunch, followed by what sounded like someone falling over into some bushes. I stood up, turned around, and shouted, "Who's there?" But no one replied. It was dead silent, and I had the creeps. I put my robe on and went inside. The next day I told my neighbor friend and crush about this, and she thought I was being ridiculous, but nonetheless agreed to go with me to check out that part of the woods to see if there was any evidence of anyone or anything hiding in the direction that I had heard the noise coming from. We stomped through the woods until we got to where we could see the back of my house. We checked every shrub and every blackberry bush, but found nothing. It was probably a coyote or something, deciding on whether or not you'd make a good dinner, the neighbor girl said, snarking. I playfully flipped her off, then laughed, quietly relieved that there was no creepy person stalking me the previous night. Well, of course, I might have been wrong about that, because that night, when I was making my usual sandwich, our security light came on, and I raced to the back door to see what was up. I saw what I could barely make out to be a shadowy, 6 foot tall or so figure disappear from the trail and into the brush to the right of it. My heart skipped a beat, and my dog, probably sensing my nerves, began barking wildly. I opened the door and shouted, "The fuck's out there? Come out!" Of course, there was nothing but silence. After sitting in the dining room for an hour, I figured that I was being paranoid and seeing what I was subconsciously afraid of being out there. I called my neighbor back, and she, surprisingly, did not call me crazy and told me she would tell her dad about it in the morning. I never saw this sort of thing again, and my neighbor's dad chalked it up to being a homeless person camping out in the woods. Or, at the very most, a stalker from one of the houses around ours. Something he explained wouldn't be surprising as my sister was quite a looker, and he thought it made sense that she would have a stalker, as if this was supposed to make me feel better. Well, I suppose it did in the end, as months passed and I forgot about it fairly quickly. That is, until a local news bulletin came out about a sexual predator having been recently apprehended by local police, after a report from a couple living a few houses down from us was filed about the wife being approached by the tall and gaunt man in the evening hours as she was watering her garden boxes. She said he suddenly appeared, quietly as if he were trying to sneak up on her. When she noticed him, she demanded his name, but he darted back into the woods. She called the sheriff immediately, and half an hour or so later the department combed through the woods and apprehended the man, who was hiding under a fallen tree. All the report said was that the man claimed he was living in the woods for months, surviving on snacks from a nearby gas station, and would not give a reason for why he was out there. However, he was apparently wanted for numerous sexual offenses on minors and vulnerable adults some years prior, whatever those ended up being. Now, years later, I still get uncomfortable looking into the woods at night, anywhere I live. Who can blame me? I was around 12 years old, and me and my friend were in the mountains. I can't recall the name of the village, but it was situated in the Czech Republic. We were on a hike and stumbled upon an old military station or bunker, just left there after World War II. We went home for flashlights and came back just before the sun was out. We went inside and found that it had like 2 or 3 floors underground, maybe more, with a 40-meter well full of frozen water on the ground floor. We decided to go down and explore. First floor, there was nothing unusual, just some empty concrete spaces. We went another floor down, and I saw some things on the ground that looked like dead rats from a distance. I laughed it off and went to take a closer look. They were bats, about 10 of them, just lying down, dead. They weren't like violently smashed or anything. There was no blood. It was as if they were just sleeping, not even rotten or decaying. I poked one with my foot, and the thing just rolled over. I started to get a little scared, but eager to explore further. My friend was basically halfway up the stairs at this point, nervous laughing, saying, "Yeah, we should really go, I have a bad feeling," or something like that. I was almost pulled to continue exploring. Half of me knew that it didn't feel right, but I ignored my friend and continued on. I was almost there, and I suddenly got sick in my gut. That feeling that's screaming in you, the adrenaline. I took another couple of stairs, shining with my flashlight ahead, and then I saw it. I scanned the whole floor, seeing the stairs that went even further below collapsed, so no getting further down, and as I looked across the room with my flashlight, there was a spot that it could not illuminate. In the middle of that spot, there stood the shadow of a man. The flashlight's beam just couldn't get through the form of it. It ate all of the light. I then realized how cold that it had become. I could see my breath. I was staring, paralyzed, for what seems like minutes, but was probably only a couple of seconds. The shadow got a little closer as I blinked. No need to say, I bolted like I never did before, not even caring if it was behind me or what it was, just running for my life. I got to the entrance and my friend was looking at me horrified, and I just told him to run while rushing past him. We sprinted for about 5 minutes, then confirmed that yes, we were still alive. When we got home, he told me that he had seen something in the corner as I ran past him, so it wasn't just me. His father told us the next day that a lot of soldiers had died there, and there's even an army museum nearby. So was it the ghost of a soldier or a shadow person? When I, a 24-year-old female, was younger, around 5, my family moved into an old house on the upstairs floor. An older couple lived below us. This was a long time ago, and I was really little, but I remember this all so vividly. When we were first moving in, my mom had to go up to the attic, which, coincidentally, the door was in what would be my room. She took me and my younger brother up with her because I'm assuming she didn't want to leave us unsupervised. I remember not liking it up there, and then the light turned off. Both my brother and I started screaming about red eyes. I do remember them. It wasn't just one. It was a bunch or a few. I couldn't tell you how many. It turns out that the light turning off was my dad because he didn't think anyone was up there. He turned the light back on and asked what was going on, and me and my brother were still hysterical. The thing is, no one remembers this but me. Not even my brother. I chalk it up to a bad nightmare, except for the fact that I remember every detail. And it turns out a mother had drowned her baby in that attic, and my parents had experiences there as well. I feel like that house was the start of my acknowledgement or awareness of the paranormal.
I saw something tonight. I just got home from my job delivering pizzas in a small town in North Carolina, and my heart is still pounding from what I saw. I just started recently, and this is my first night shift. I hope it was my last. I was going back to the store after a delivery, a little after 9 p.m., when I saw it riding towards me on a bicycle. It looked like a person for the most part, but it was wearing one of those blank plastic Halloween masks like you can get at any store. The mask had a wavy line from the top left, wearer's right, to the bottom right, which separated the mask into a purple half and an orange half. I couldn't tell what it was wearing because it was too dark and the clothes were black. Out of the top of the mask, there was something that could have been hair, but it seemed too strange to me. The hair was at least a foot tall on its own, and the only way I can describe it is as a plant of some sort. It looked like a bunch of tangled branches and vines all sprouting from the thing's head. It was doing a wheel stand all the way down the street toward me without losing an iota of balance. The thing that really tipped me off that it wasn't human, though, was the aura it gave. I couldn't stop looking at it for more than a second. It drew my eyes almost magnetically, and every second I did look at it, the more terrified I felt. It wasn't just my natural reaction of fear either. This was powerful and evil. My head started pounding. I was screaming involuntarily, and tears welled up in my eyes. I was about to make a turn when I saw it coming toward me, and as soon as I completed the turn, barely able to look at where I was going, the thing disappeared. I turned around to look back down the street I was just on, and it was gone. I was still extremely rattled, panting and whining like a dog, but I knew I had to make it back to the store. I made a slight left onto the long avenue where my store is located when I saw it riding toward me again, still doing a wheel stand. It started out on my right, but rode around me to get on my left as I proceeded toward the store. I was trying my best to outrun it, but it was keeping up with me exactly until it suddenly jumped off the bike onto the sidewalk and caught it without effort. I was still screaming and tearlessly crying this whole time, but I whipped my truck into the store lot, hoping it meant safety. To my horror, I saw a bicycle, not belonging to anyone in the store, leaned up against the wall directly in front of my parking spot. I looked across the street to where I had seen the thing hit the ground and saw that nothing was there. I hesitated to even leave my truck, but I had to complete my shift, so I went inside with my guard up as much as it could be considering how terrified I was. My co-workers were all fine, but there were no customers in the store. That's not unusual considering the time of night, but that meant that the bicycle's owner was MIA. I rubbed my face for a few moments in front of a fan and grabbed my next delivery. I exited the store to discover the bicycle was gone even though I hadn't noticed anyone move it. I worked the rest of my shift until 10 and didn't see the thing again. That's not to say that there was nothing out of the ordinary, but the bike stalker was gone at least. The whole way home, I was unnaturally paranoid. Around every curve and corner, I feared it would be standing in the road, waiting for me. I could see it in my head. The vision I had of it standing on a certain bridge on my way home felt so real that I nearly drove into the creek. I'm home now, in what I hope is safety, but I'm definitely still on edge. I've seen a lot of things in my 20 years, but I have never experienced anything like that.
When I was growing up, there had been a few forests around town that had famous stories linked to them. The people believed that the forests were cursed from the Native American tribes who were relocated from their homes way back when. They said that the forests belonged to them, and when you go in and ignore your gut feeling, those people die in those woods. When my dad and my sister and I moved when I was around 13 or so, we moved to a small town. Across the street was a hill, and at the top stood a blue water tower. I used to hang out in the woods across the street from my house. It was quiet, and the birds always chirped. Other kids were scared of the woods, but I went up there to draw and listen to the birds. Also, because it was at the top of a hill, I could look out and see the entire town and feel the breeze. But when the animals went quiet, it was time to go. When the school year started, I found out that it was an ancient Indian burial ground. Every year our class would go up the hill and learn about it, and the town and the school was actually really respectful of the forest and the hill. We took care of the trees there. If you looked at the ground, you could still see a lot of Native American arrowheads. We never took them home, though, and were not supposed to. I didn't, at least. I would actually go into the forest when I was walking home because the bullies were too scared to go in. I felt safe there, but I also had to remember to respect it. In the forest, we also had wood piles. When we would go into the forest, we would make piles for the local foxes to nest in during the winter time. Once I went to school after retreating into the forest from one of my bullies the other day. A couple of my classmates ran up to me and said, "What did you do, Jacob?" I looked at the kid and said, "Nothing, why?" They looked at each other and said, "Well, something scared him, and we thought you had scared him. in the woods," I said. "I didn't scare him. I just went in there to hang out." It was the time that Jacob threw a rock at me, and I remember it landed to my right, and I hurried up my pace in the woods, and I thought that he had left at that point, like he always did. He screamed "raccoon" at me, and when I reached the top of the hill, I cried and went home because for some reason that time the bullying hurt. Whatever happened to Jacob in the woods, I'll never know. He stopped bullying me from that day forward and said sorry to me and that it would never happen again. He did say something happened in the woods, but he never said by what or who. Just had a look of terror and practically begged me to accept his apology. I told him it's all right and I went on my way. He could never look me in the eye again. That was back in middle school. When I went to college, I saw him at a 4th of July college event. I was going to catch up with him about life and put the bullying behind us. He glanced, but still looked so uneasy that I simply walked by. Also, sometimes my sister would walk home with me after school, only once or twice that I can recall. Every time we entered the woods, she felt lost. I even had her lead us, and she couldn't follow the trail. It's like she kept seeing these invisible trails that went in circles. She started to breathe heavy and cry and said we were lost, and she had an anxiety attack and just told me that we had to get out of the woods. I was totally chill and knew the forest pretty well, and I let us out, and it was easy. It was literally just 3 trails, one from the south, one from the north, and one going up the hill to our house. You could get in and out of the forest in under 10 minutes, from one side to the other.
It was a white, 4-legged thing. I've been watching a lot of creepy encounter videos of this guy telling stories people have written on Reddit. A few of them seemed awfully familiar to the one that I just laughed off at the time, but now I'm seriously wondering if I actually saw something. I've never told anyone this outside of my small friend circle. I'm genuinely curious as to what others might think it is. This happened a few years ago. I'm from Ontario, Canada, and the amount of trails out here is astounding. The set of trails I walk on a regular basis cut through the city I live in and run along the river. There's plenty of wildlife, and on a few occasions I've sat and watched deer along the riverside. Whatever this was, it was unlike anything I'd seen before, even if it was only for a brief moment. It was in the summertime, so my friend Kinder and I were out on the trails while the sun was setting. It was getting dark, and because of how dense the trees and bush are along the trails, it was getting harder and harder to see, even if the sun hadn't set completely. I had my phone flashlight out so we could at least see the trail. I also had some music playing. I had stopped for a second to change the song, and Kinder suddenly goes, "What's that?" after a series of noises broke out beside us. Slowly, I turned my flashlight to the bush off on the left side of the path. The light shines on this large, white figure. It was so white it was pretty much reflecting the light I was shining onto it. It was walking on 4 legs, and it was way too large to be a deer. Too white, too. From what I remember, it had skin. No fur. It wasn't a dog. If I could describe the texture in the short amount of time I had between me looking at this thing and booking it, it was almost rubbery. This was all I could take in before it ran off in the opposite direction of where we were looking. I didn't stick around for very long either. Same could have been my last words before the two of us took off running. We joked about it a lot, saying we saw the wraith and that my last words would have been same. I surprisingly didn't feel any fear right away. The fear didn't set in until after we ran away from whatever it was. Maybe that came from the sudden shock of seeing this white figure running away through the trees and brush. Needless to say, I don't walk those trails at dusk anymore.
I'm going to preface this post by saying that paranormal experiences are not unknown to me. I have seen ghosts many times over my life, and my mom claims to have seen me playing with them as a child. She was a psychic medium, so I spent a good deal of my childhood around this stuff, but those experiences are for another time. This is just to assure you that I have had experiences with the paranormal before, and that what I experienced I consider to be abnormal generally, as most of my experiences up until now have been positive, or at least neutral. This was a few years ago in my very early 20s. I'm in my mid to late 20s now. I haven't had any paranormal experiences since a little while after my mom passed away when I was a teenager. I was starting to think the things I had experienced didn't happen at all. General denial. One night, on a whim, while driving around a suburb near my house, I managed to convince my boyfriend to come with me to the local cemetery. I was going through a bit of an edgy phase and thought that going to a graveyard at night would be cool. This is a cemetery in a big city, and it's extremely large. I didn't believe in ghosts hanging around in a cemetery, so I thought that it would be fine. I believed that ghosts usually hung around the places that they died, or places where they had unfinished business, and that it was very unlikely that they would actually be in a graveyard. It was sometime in October, but not Halloween. We got to the cemetery around 11:30 p.m. We had our phones with us and were using them as torches. We hopped the fence to the cemetery and began to look at all the graves, pointing out the most interesting ones and kind of just messing around. The place was completely deserted, as cemeteries tend to be at that time of night. We walked further and further in and entered a part of the cemetery where the graves were quite a bit larger and much older. By now it had likely been around half an hour. As we were walking down the path, my boyfriend commented that there was a strange smell lingering around, which was extremely weird, as my boyfriend cannot smell at all. He lost his sense of smell due to a bunch of infections and other problems with his ears and sinuses as a kid. I couldn't smell anything, and I have an above average sense of smell, so we both just shrugged the experience off as just weird. Later on, I was looking at one of the graves when my boyfriend shook my shoulder and pointed at one of the largest graves a few meters into the distance. I'm terrible at knowing where people are pointing, but this time I spotted it right away. It was a little girl, I'd guess around 11 or 12 years old. She had very dark brown or black hair that looked well cared for and quite long. She was sitting on top of the grave, with her legs dangling over the edge. At first I saw her wearing a lacy white dress, like a nightgown that a rich girl might wear. It looked old, but I'm no expert, so I couldn't tell you exactly how old, but maybe the 1900s, early 1900s? I looked away to look at my boyfriend, and when I looked back, she was wearing a different dress. All I remember is that it was red, because at this point I was super scared. Something about the entire situation felt wrong to me. I felt extremely fearful, and due to the fact that ghosts were very normal for me, this was extremely unusual. I would never feel unsafe seeing a ghost in the past. It was around this time that I noticed that the cemetery was eerily quiet. There were no sounds of bats, and there were a lot of fruit bats in that area. There were no other sounds of animals, and the air felt stale and stagnant. We just stood and stared at the little girl for what felt like an eternity, weirdly transfixed, and then we both ran for it up the path at full speed. I turned for a second to see if she was still there, and she was gone completely. It made me run faster, honestly, and the whole time we were both dead silent. When we got back to our car, we sat there for ages trying to work out what we had just witnessed. We were trying to rationalize it, but as we have both had paranormal experiences before, we knew it had to be a ghost. For a few months afterward, I felt continuously like I was being watched, and had frequent nightmares about seeing the little girl in our apartment. I always felt uneasy. We eventually moved around 30 minutes away, and the feelings and the dreams stopped. I've since tried to research the ghost, but haven't had anything turn up, though there is a local ghost tour at the cemetery, and maybe the guide might know something. Ever since then, my paranormal experiences have been more frequent, and have been getting more unsettling and disturbing. My boyfriend has been experiencing things more frequently as well.
This happened about 10 years ago. Me and DH were in our early 20s and renting a small flat in a tiny rural village in southern England. This didn't happen to me, but to my DH, who is a very straight-talking, no-nonsense person. I have never known him to lie. He has recounted this story to me a few times over the years and never strayed in the details. Whatever happened is a memory for him. He really believes that whatever he saw, he saw. Our home had woods and commons nearby that DH and his friends would play some sort of midnight commando hunting game in. They were out one night when DH came home early, panicked and out of breath. He said that he had been crouching in the bushes alone, but not too far from his friends when he noticed something else, also crouching, through the leaves maybe 10 meters away. It was humanoid in shape, but possibly with longer, leaner limbs. It had silverish skin in the dark. DH couldn't entirely believe what he was seeing and puffed himself up and started walking toward it. He said he got to about 5 meters away, fully expecting to find it was a deer or maybe a homeless person. As he got closer, he was increasingly sure that it wasn't anything normal. It had a humanoid face, and was not frightened of him. He said the thing that freaked him out and made him run away was the fact that it didn't move or run. It just carried on watching him as he ran toward it. When he stopped and looked at it closer up, he turned around and legged it in the other direction and said he heard the thing move too behind him. He didn't look back, but as he was slowing down back towards the edge of the forest, he was quite unfit at the time, he heard leaves rustling to the side of him and saw it again through the trees, still watching him and only a few meters away. He pegged it again, but bumped into a couple of his friends on his way out. He told them to get out of the forest. His friends didn't take him seriously, but did amble back to our house without seeing anything. DH was scared, though, and you can tell the story still frightens him. Maybe he was in paranoid commando hunting mode and making fight eyes with a humanoid-looking tree stump. I don't know. I don't usually believe in these things or like to think about them. I did used to get an extremely creepy feeling from the woods nearby to that. You had to walk through to cut from the train station to our home. I didn't like staying in that flat alone. I also found it strange that there was wild garlic growing everywhere around the edge of our village, the next village, and most of the woods and commons. When we looked into the history of the area, we realized that the big manor house next to the village used to be inhabited by a soldier who survived being shot 28 times and came back to England with a harem of women. I half-jokingly suggested that this soldier was a vampire, and that's what DH saw. But I like to think it was just a humanoid-looking tree stump.
This happened to me when I was in high school. I was around 15, 16 years old, so it was around 2005 or 2006. Now, for context, this happened in France in a medium-sized city. I had to take one bus and one tramway, to get to my high school. It was about 45 minutes to a 1-hour trip. Usually classes start at 8:15 a.m. and the tram would be packed up with people as my high school was located next to the university and another high school. But that day my class started at 10 a.m. As a result, the tram was practically empty, which meant that I could get a seat for once. There was no seat by my side, only one seat in front of me. So I was sitting there listening to my music when a man sat down in front of me. He quickly started talking to me. I honestly don't remember what he was saying, but I was trying not to be rude as he seemed to have some sort of mild mental disability. But very quickly he started asking me out. Remember, I was underage and I definitely looked my age. He wondered if I wanted to go and get a drink. I said that I couldn't, that I had to go to class. He was very persistent. At some point he took out his wallet and offered me money. I remember him saying something like, "If it's about money, don't worry about it." He pulled out about $200 in cash. I was already creeped out by now and couldn't wait to get out of that tram, but I was also too shy to get out and sit somewhere else. That's when he pulled out a piece of paper. He was holding it in the air, and I remember him doing a motion with his head like, "Look at this" type of motion. It was an article from a newspaper that he had cut and kept inside of his wallet. I only had a few seconds to read what the article was about. All I had time to see was that something had happened to a woman. She had been assaulted. But that's it. That's all I had time to read before he put it back away. Now, as if this wasn't creepy enough, he had a giant smile on his face, like he was proud of himself, that type of smile. Whether he knew that woman or if this was a random article he for some reason decided to keep with him at all times, it's just extremely unsettling. Not only that, but showing it to a random girl? Why? The piece of paper itself looked like it's been in his wallet for some time. It was a little torn, but definitely wasn't old. I eventually arrived at my stop. He kept insisting on meeting again. I denied and quickly walked to my school. After that, I saw him again, once, a few days later. This time the tram was packed again, but I still felt the need to hide behind the people surrounding me, just in case he would see me and come talk to me again. The second time I saw him was maybe 2 or 3 years after. He looked exactly the same. I recognized him instantly. He was walking in the streets of the city and didn't see me. I realized I didn't give a physical description of the man, so here it is. He was average height, dark brown hair on the chubby side. He had glasses on, and the 3 times I saw him, he was always carrying a big backpack. The exact same military green backpack, and the same jacket. When I was a kid, I lived in a 1-story house that had a very small space that you could consider an attic. We didn't keep anything up there because it was such a small space. I don't even know where the entrance to it was, if there was one. But, and this started right as we moved in, after we would go to bed, I lived with my grandparents, I would start hearing footsteps up there. I knew they were footsteps because they would move in a rhythm and go from one end of the house to the other. I lived in that house from when I was 8 to 12 years old, and this happened every night. I repeatedly tried telling my grandparents about this, and they always said it was just the house settling. I was never able to sleep well as a kid, so while my grandparents would be asleep as soon as 8 p.m. struck, I would be lying awake in bed staring at the ceiling. It was always the most terrifying when the footsteps stopped right above me, like right over my bed, and then in a few seconds to minutes they would walk back to some other location up there. Nobody ever believed me that this was happening. My granddad had even found holes that had apparently been drilled in several of the walls, one in the bathroom, and he wrote it off as a previous owner running cables through the walls. Lived in that house for 4 years, and was convinced that someone was living in the ceiling above us and would become active when they thought that we had gone to sleep. I'll never forget that. It always happened at the same time of night, right after we went to bed. This was back in the late 90s to the early 2000s, so I don't know if there could have been cameras or something that they could have been watching us on, but they definitely knew when we went to bed. I'm still to this day convinced that someone was up there. Paranormal? I don't know. It's worth mentioning that one of the previous owner's kids did die in the house. They had a wolf-dog hybrid as a pet that mauled him in the living room. Anyway, I thought I'd share that because literally no one believed me, ever, to this day. But I know that footsteps are different from houses settling. This would go on into the wee hours of the morning, and I would usually finally pass out when the footsteps had gone off to a different part of the house. I was around 7 years old when this encounter happened. I was visiting my aunt and uncle's old house for dinner and a movie at their place. They reside in this town about 1 hour west of the city that I live in. It was around 10 p.m. and the sun had set. Darkness permeated the outdoors. I remember laying down on the couch watching a film, but I was half asleep. Before I intended on sleeping, I felt the urge to go urinate, so I made my way to the hallway leading to the bathroom. This is when things started to get weird. The hallway in the house has 2 doors on the left-hand side, and 2 doors on the right-hand side, followed by the bathroom door, which is straight ahead. The first door on the left was for storage, the second being my aunt and uncle's bedroom. The first door on the right led to the basement, and the second to the guest room. Before I made my way to the bathroom, I had the urge to look inside my aunt and uncle's bedroom, and I was in complete shock at what I saw. There was the silhouette of a slender figure dressed in what appeared to be an all-black dress suit, although it could have been anything, as this figure was darker than the darkness surrounding it. The thing was nearly 7 feet tall, but was not wearing a hat, and I couldn't make out any facial features. There was no way it could have been my family members, as they were all in the living room still watching the movie. As I was standing there in silence, the figure barely budged, and I just went on to do my business. As I left the bathroom, I looked back to see if this figure was there, and sure enough, it was gone. I bolted down the hallway and plowed my face into the pillows in fear. When my family asked why I ran into the couch like that, I mentioned that it was because I saw a ghost or something. They didn't think much of it at the time, thinking that kids, just have their imaginations. But I know what I saw. I live near one of the oldest cemeteries in Portland, Oregon. It's pioneer era. The oldest graves are from the 1850s, and it's still active today, funerals all the time. Anyway, I go walk and jog through there pretty often. I usually jog a couple miles, and then finish up with some wind sprints. There's a spot where it's straight for about 60 or 70 yards, so I'll do 8 or 10 of these things and then quit. The spot where I usually start running from is right near the grave of a young boy who was born in 1896 and died in 1902. I've done some research, and all of his family is actually buried in a different cemetery, so I always feel a little sad about it. His name is Carl, and it's weird maybe, but I talk to the kid's grave as I'm resting up between sprints. For whatever reason, that's the only grave in there that I've ever paid much attention to, and about the only one that I'd ever done any research on. Not sure why exactly. A couple weeks ago on Wednesday, I was doing my thing. I stopped at my normal spot, said hi to Carl, and instantly got this sickening feeling that I was in danger. I looked up at this tree, big old oak, branches around 1.5 feet in diameter. I was absolutely terrified, and I started running and got the hell out of the way. I was absolutely 100% sure that this branch was going to fall and kill me. I waited a few minutes, and came back over and started looking at this big oak tree and the horse chestnut right beside it. I couldn't decide which tree actually was going to fall, so I sort of blew it off as paranoia. Not really a credible premonition or whatever. The next day, on Thursday, I go for a run, avoiding that area. When I finished up, I went back and stopped next to Carl's grave. It was a little later than I usually go, mid-afternoon, and it's getting pretty hot out, so I wasn't really looking forward to running more. I didn't actually hear anything, but something told me you shouldn't go any further. So it's hot, I'm tired, I'm paranoid. I noped out and went home. The next day it's Friday. I go back into the cemetery. A massive branch from the oak tree had fallen, knocked about 5 branches off of the horse chestnut. It all landed on Carl's grave and right on the part of the path that I usually jog on. Some parks workers were already cutting the trees up to clear the way. I asked one guy when it had fallen, and he said it had happened sometime on Thursday afternoon. I have no idea if I actually would have been there at that time at that spot, but it was weird enough to freak me out a little bit. Anyway, thanks, Carl. I've always had some kind of interest in the paranormal. As someone who grew up in a religious household but has always struggled with the concept of faith, I think what's always drawn me to it is the idea of proof. Proof of something beyond this life. Proof that death isn't the end. So I guess that's what set me up for this experience. This was 4-ish years ago on an October night. This happened with 2 friends of mine who I'll call Jim and Lisa. I've known Jim since 2nd grade, and Lisa since high school. Lisa and I went to the same college for a bit, and we had a mutual interest in the paranormal. Given the time of year that it was, close to Halloween, we decided to go and do some ghost hunting of our own. I called up Jim, who also had some interest, and planned to meet up and drive to a local cemetery not far from where we were. So this place definitely has the spooky factor to it. It's on a residential road, but the section the cemetery is in is really wooded and separated from everything. It's set back on a hill, and carved into the hillside right up against the road are the keeps that they used to lay bodies out in when the ground was too frozen to do burials back in the day. Jim and I had scoped this place out during the summer during the day because it was close to where he lived, so I kinda knew the layout. We all met up and parked next to it. I had brought a voice recorder from school. I worked at the school radio station, so it was fairly nice. We started walking around and asked some innocuous questions. Lisa claims to be sensitive, which I'm skeptical of, but that will come into play a little later. As we were walking around, kind of creeped out, we walked toward the back of the cemetery. It goes fairly far back, so we were poking around reading stones with flashlights when Lisa and I could swear that we heard someone walking around near the middle of the cemetery. All 3 of us were together near the back, and there was 1000% not anyone else out there. Could it have been some college kids hyping themselves up? Maybe. It's hard for me to really confirm with hindsight whether we were being overly imaginative, but we were pretty sketched out. After about 15 to 20 minutes, we figured that we should pack it up. Lisa and I were kind of freaked out still because we were fairly convinced that something was walking around near the center of those headstones. She also kept saying that she felt like something was compelling us to leave, and that we weren't welcome. Jim was kind of indifferent and wasn't really noticing anything super crazy, so we started making our way down the hill. This is when a weird thing happened. As we were walking down the hill, I heard a stone skip past me as if someone had kicked or thrown it. I figured that it was just Jim, as he's apt to do that sort of thing. But as I looked and was about to say something to him, he was about 10 feet to my left. He definitely didn't kick anything at me. The weirdest stuff that we found was on the recorder when we got back. I want to make this clear, this was not a super windy night. There was a light breeze at best. But the recorder sounded like it was windy as hell because we caught a ton of what I call interference. It was really deep bass tones that sounded like the microphone on the recorder were being overloaded. The creepy part was that there were times where there was a rhythmic quality to it, like something was speaking but couldn't get through fully. I'd say it sounds like when someone's talking in another room with the door shut, where you can hear the noise, but not much in the way of actual words. I did get it on the other investigations with this recorder, but never at that level. So while it's possible that it could have been an issue with the recorder, I'm not entirely sure. We also got some really direct, creepy EVPs. Toward the end of our time there, you can hear me on the recorder saying, "Hey guys, we should go," in reference to the creepy walking sounds from the middle of the cemetery. During the discussion from the 3 of us, there's a moan that's pretty audible that no one heard while we were there. It sounded like something was upset that we were leaving. This was reinforced by a minute later when Lisa asked, "Do you want us to leave or do you want us to stay?" And a voice pretty clearly answered, "Stay. I want you to stay," which was creepy enough to hear in general, but the whispery quality to it makes the hair raise up on the back of my neck. The epilogue to this is Lisa claimed that there was weird stuff happening all around her house the weekend after we went. Banging on the wall, noises in the other rooms. Full disclosure, Lisa does have a bit of history with mental illness, so I guess you might could chalk it up to that. The part that gives me pause is that we were talking about this at school one day and her sister called from the house complaining about all the weird crap that was happening. While I think her sister also has some sort of history, I think it's mostly anxiety-based, but I'm not 100% sure honestly. I do find it a stretch that her sister would call and make a big deal out of it if stuff wasn't legitimately taking place. I only wish that I'd gone to the house and experienced whatever it was firsthand just to see for myself. My mom and I moved into a house when I was in the 5th grade. For the record, I'm 25 now. And there was a room in the attic that looked like it was actually built to be part of the house and not some makeshift DIY room. The attic was also not your typical attic with a pull-down door, but a walk-through door. Anyway, the layout was that it made an L shape, and all wooden, and the room was obvious at the end of the L. We used the attic for Christmas decorations and whatnot. But anyhow, on with the story. I turned the room into my little hangout area. The only thing in there when we moved in was a wooden table with 4 chairs and then some weird bench that I hear was a bed, but it didn't look big enough. So me and my friends would always go in there to hang out, play games and whatnot. Well, one day I accidentally broke the table and was worried that my mom was going to be mad at me. I don't think she would have cared since the stuff was so old. But out of fear, I just grabbed all the stuff that I owned and left the room, closing the door behind me. I think I remember once going back in there a few years later, like 9th grade maybe, but never actually spent an extended period of time. I would always stack the Christmas decorations in front of the wall and door to it. The year before we moved, we decided to move everything into the garage after Christmas for my senior year in high school. That way we didn't have to deal with it when the movers showed up. We never used the garage anyway, but got rid of lots of stuff the year prior, so we had plenty of room. That was the last official time I saw the door. But the absolute last time I stepped foot in that house, the stuff was all packed away, on the truck preparing to leave, and I was doing one last walkthrough when I decided to go into that room and make sure that I didn't forget anything and leave it behind. I went to go to the attic, and it was missing. Nothing but a blank wall. Like there was no way a room could have ever even have been there. I was shocked and asked my mom, but she had no idea. I even called my friends to verify, and yeah, they all remembered the room, but she didn't. It was odd. Very odd. I never felt anything weird about the room at all. Like, I'm pretty sensitive to paranormal stuff, and this just seemed like some random room. The house, in my opinion, was haunted because a guy hung himself in the living room, but I don't believe that that was connected. So much can happen in the forest. There are wild animals, possibly bad people, and the unknown itself. While hiking in Switzerland, I decided to see Matterhorn, the famous mountain, up close. As close as I could. So I left the village I was staying in early and walked through meadows, hills, and then up the mountains to reach the plateau. Early in the morning, after just leaving the town, I walked the straight path. Past some houses on the left, town behind, mountain ahead, and forest on the right. In front of the forest, there were a few curious old huts on long legs, ones that you climb up to by ladder. They were all made of round planks and black soot. My imagination immediately called them witch huts, relating them to movies and legends that I knew. They seemed closed, and I couldn't get into any of them, but I felt a slight shiver of excitement, and didn't really want to get in. So I kept on walking. I saw the mountain, met some people, had lunch, and in the afternoon decided to walk back to town. I remembered the way and backtracked pretty much exactly. On my way back, the mountain was behind me, the town ahead, houses and meadows on the right, and black spooky huts on the left, guiding the entrance, a path leading into the forest. I should note that despite checking out the huts in the morning, I didn't notice that there was a forest path starting behind them. Curious about it, I checked the wooden road signs placed in the vicinity of the huts. To my surprise, the one pointing into the woods said Zermatt, but the one pointing to where I originally came from in the morning said some other town's name. I was very confused. I looked back and looked again, thinking that maybe my brain was tricking me, but I kept seeing what I saw. I stood there while a few hikers passed in each direction. All stayed on the mountain path, nobody went into the forest or looked at the road signs. I sat there in front of the huts and smoked a cigarette. I debated whether or not I should go into the forest, why the signs showed such weird directions. I wondered if there was a reason I should go in. But I was already very tired to the point of my legs feeling weak. So I decided to go back the way I came, to trust my gut and take the most common main path back to town. When I stood up, the signs were different again. There was no way anyone could have rearranged them. No wind or human. I was there the whole time, and the only people who walked by didn't stop at the signs, let alone tinker with them. The one pointing into the forest said some other name, and the one pointing to my starting point said Zermatt like it should. I told this story to my friend in Zermatt, and he just laughed at the idea of paranormal entities trying to lure me into the forest. I did have a creepy feeling about the huts, but at the same time it was a beautiful day, and I still wonder whether there was some kind of adventure waiting for me if I took the forest path. What do you think?
Ominous under a streetlight. So this was around 5 years ago. A friend and I went to a local recreation center/park in our city. It was always pretty empty the few times I'd been there, except for the after-school kids sometimes. That summer we adventured day and night, always somewhere fun and always somewhere outdoors. Before I go any further, we definitely smoked flower on all adventures. Daily. Smoked all day. Functioning people. Pretty much. We didn't hallucinate when we get high. We played on the swings and slides and decided to leave. Got in the car, turned it on. To the front right of the car was an orangish street light next to the bathrooms. Underneath stood a tall figure, maybe 7 feet. The only way I have been able to describe it is a pumpkin-shaped head, and it was off. We both froze and I looked over, he was driving, and asked if he sees that. I do, and we're getting out of here. Anytime one of us brings it up, there's an eerie feeling. That image is burned into my skull. I want to know what we saw.
The story I'm about to tell happened when I was little, so basically it's my mother's and my uncle's version of it. When I was 4 years old, I was really sick. I basically couldn't digest the food that I ate, so my body had no defenses. I even spent weeks in intensive care at the hospital. The thing is, nobody knew what was wrong with me. For a year, 3 different doctors were trying to figure out what was happening. They made me do a lot of tests, even for rare conditions, but they were always negative. My mom was completely desperate. In her own words, "You were gonna die before I could even figure out what was taking you away." One day, my mom was with me at my uncle's house. He's my dad's brother, and he lives with his wife and the mom of his wife, who was like a grandmother to me. So this old woman told my mom that she was beginning to think that I was possessed by a spirit. I live in a place with a lot of esoteric beliefs and traditions, especially followed by the old people. She asked my mother if she remembered going to the cemetery while she was pregnant with me. At that moment, my mother remembered that she had gone to bring flowers to her father's grave on the day of All Saints. There's a legend here that if you go to the cemetery while you're pregnant or with a newborn baby, the spirits will try to possess it so that they can get to live again. My mom and uncle threw me into the car to take me to a church known for such cases. They said that I was screaming and crying the whole way in the back of the car. Let me get out. I don't want to go there. I didn't even know where we were going or why, since they didn't tell me anything. My uncle was driving and suddenly we hit a traffic jam. He tried to slow down the car and then he realized that the brakes weren't responding. He kept stepping on the brakes without the car responding until we were about to hit the car that was standing right in front of us. All of this happened in a matter of seconds. Then the car stopped completely, just inches away from colliding. When we were sitting still, the strangest thing of the trip happened. They both felt as if several people from the outside of the car were pushing the car, shaking it to one side and the other. I was still screaming. Long story short, we arrived to the church. I didn't want to come in, but I finally did. I was crying all the time. When we got out, I was in a much better mood. My mom bought me donuts on our way to the car. I ate one and then puked, but it was as if I had puked up something with sandy texture. Something completely dry. My uncle stopped the car and got me out in case I was going to keep getting sick. Suddenly, I did a strange sound. It was like a burp, but way too loud and deep sounding for a small 4-year-old kid. As a kid growing up, I dealt with anger problems and would always let my emotions get the best of me, so my mom would always send me off to these residential programs. However, they weren't all that bad. If you did good, you could go on these what they called passes. It's when if you do good, you can come home for X amount of hours. So I was doing good and already had been on a few of these passes, and I got to come home for 48 hours. It was Halloween and me, my mom, my sister, and a couple of friends got together and went to this haunted house. So when we arrived, there's a line of people who are waiting to enter, and I had to take a leak really bad because I had sat in the car for hours waiting to get there. I walked to the side of the building, and there's nothing but woods literally growing next to the building, like there were tree branches leaning against and on the structure. So, as I was taking this long leak, I heard something step on a couple of sticks, and I noticed a dark shadow figure on all fours creeping up toward me. It looked kind of like a human on all fours, but this was definitely not a human. Like I said earlier, I've dealt with a lot of problems during my childhood. I didn't even have a childhood, so I was very different from a lot of people in so many ways. I didn't have a big reaction to it. I just kind of watched it and made sure that I wasn't seeing things. I tried to keep an eye on it and called my friends over to where I was to get a look. They were caught up in a conversation though and weren't paying attention, so I tried to run over to get them and get their attention and then run back to make sure this thing was still there. By the time I got them and ran over to the area, there was nothing. This thing had disappeared without a trace. I couldn't even explain to them what just happened. They didn't pay much attention to me after that. A couple of weeks went by and I just forgot about it and let it be. Moving from a small town to a large city at a fairly young age had to be one of the biggest adjustments I've ever had to make. I knew no one. I had no idea how different it really was. I had no reason to think about it before we had to move. Not only was the way of life much different, but so were the people and the experiences. There were so many more buildings, cars, and people in general. And the dangers that lurked only just began to come so real for me. I've always had strange things happen to me that couldn't be explained, but I would always just shrug them off. I would play it off as if I was just tired most times and making myself see things that were not really there. Besides, I had no one to talk to about these strange encounters, and I was a young teenager. Who would really believe these outrageous things that I would just seemingly come up with? The church-going family that we were just wouldn't allow for such nonsense. The Lord protects us from all evil, that kind of jazz. On moving to the city, I eventually got settled after some time of rebelling. I was your normal, typical teenager, and I was angry because I felt like I had been made to leave my friends behind. I got into a lot of trouble and fell into all the wrong crowds. The whole stereotypes that people have of teenagers. I seemed to allow myself to live up to that stereotypical standard. I knew that what I was doing was wrong, but I didn't care. I found myself in some sticky situations that finally led me to a friend that showed me that what I was doing wasn't getting me anywhere with my life. For this story, we'll call him Bob. Bob was an older man. He was, I would say, at least 12 years older than I was. I was 13 at the time that we met. He had moved in downstairs from us with a friend of his that my parents knew. We met while helping his friend move furniture out of his apartment to have his carpets cleaned. Fast forward some time and Bob and I became close friends. Yes, it was odd myself being friends with someone so much older than I was, but somehow it worked at the time. There was this cemetery that was up the street from our apartment complex. We would go there regularly to visit graves and help clean them and place flowers on those that were unmarked to show that someone still cared for these people. We would always go during the day. It was such a beautiful and peaceful place. There were many rose bushes, green grass, tall shrubs, and some really pretty water fountains spread out across this large piece of land. It was easy to just stroll around there all day and lose track of time completely. One day we came upon this one tall, mass grave that was unmarked. It was so old that the headstone was crumbling, and the lot that it was on was caving in and had a hole about a foot or so deep just underneath the concrete slab. We were both curious about it and would visit the grave a few times this one week. We weren't sure what it was about this grave that drew us back to it each time, but we visited this person quite often. I can recall this time that we had gone later in the day. It was just an hour or so until it got dark. We were never there when it was dark because they locked the gates, and if they found you there after a certain time, they would kick you out. But they never saw us or bothered to tell us to leave. We were, of course, at this unmarked grave once again. Nighttime had finally fallen, and it was pretty dark. There were a few lights in the cemetery, but it was just a soft glow that filled the area we happened to be at. Bob and I wandered around that unmarked grave, and were admiring the other headstones around it. We just couldn't believe how old that they actually were. We ended up circling back, getting ready to head home. We walked back past the unmarked grave to say goodbye. I remember standing there on the side of the grave, where the hole was. I was just thinking, how could they not fix this, and wondered how far down that it went. Being the curious idiot that I was, I kneeled down next to this hole and decided to stick my arm into it. It was so deep that you couldn't feel any kind of gravel or soil below. I guess Bob had just kept walking, so there I was with my hand in this hole below this concrete slab. I stood up and went to turn around to walk toward Bob. He was a ways off in the distance, but I could still see him. Before I could take a step, though, I felt like my body wasn't moving. It was as if someone had a huge hold on me. I couldn't move, and I couldn't speak. I was stuck. Bob finally notices me standing where he left me, and starts yelling for me to come on. But there was no moving for me, and I felt this grip just getting tighter and tighter. It felt like forever watching as Bob made his way back in my direction, going on about how he wanted to get home, how it was late. He was standing in front of me and looked at me like I'd completely lost it. He had been talking to me and asking me questions, and I, of course, could not move or make a sound. He reaches out to grab me to pull me along, and I didn't budge. As we stood there, he kept talking to me, seemingly thinking that I was messing with him, and he was laughing. Tears began to roll down my face. All I could think about was, how am I going to get this thing to let me go? Did I make it mad? I just kept apologizing in my head, saying how sorry I was for disturbing them, and that if they let me go that I would never bother them again. I'm assuming that they must have known that I was sorry for what I did. I drop to the gravel, and I quickly bolt up and take off running. I ended up leaving Bob behind. He came knocking on my door the next day to ask what happened. I had no idea how to even explain what I had experienced. All I know is that I have never bothered that grave again. I posted this in a UFO subreddit, as I was not sure what a crawler was until after doing a bit of research. There's a possibility that what I saw that night may have been a crawler as much as it could have been an alien. I never saw a UFO, but I saw an entity mostly associated with UFOs. I grew up in the USSR, in now northern Belarus, until I was 13 years old. 37 years ago, my mother and I saw an entity outside looking in at us through the window. It was hairless, pale white, huge, bulging black eyes, and it had teeth that were very small, very well spaced, skinny, and pointed, almost like an anglerfish. We hid for hours until we heard my father return home. We both looked out to see the being stand up from behind a wall. It was much taller than a human. It was hiding back there behind that wall, and I believe that it was waiting for us to come outside. My father drove up the driveway, and we saw the silhouette of its body from the back. It was hunched over, staring at the car. My father saw it in the headlights, and what it looked like, perfectly. He drove at it, and it ran away into the brush around the house. It never made a sound. It seemed smart but cautious, and the overwhelming feeling that I got that night was that it was vicious and violent. My parents spoke with the police, as we were so horrified about the encounter. After speaking to the police or the KGB, we were relocated and forced to never speak of the event to anyone. Within 30 hours, I was living in a new home nearly 100 kilometers away. I have searched for so many years for an explanation. I've spoken to government officials in Belarus. I have had interviews with people who lived near our home then, about 10 years ago. I have no answers. In 2007, I moved into the house I currently live in. It's over 100 years old, and ever since I can remember, there have been weird or creepy things that occur. Recently, I've heard noises late at night while I'm in bed. For context, I sleep on the top floor of my house, and it's been getting really creepy. Another thing is that in the hallway we have an attic door that's bolted shut and hasn't been opened by our family or my neighbors who used to live here, from what I have been told. I decided to ask my father about it, and he told me that it wasn't a full-size attic, and is more of a crawl space which goes right over my room. And the part that creeps me out the most is that we've never had any animals besides the occasional mouse in our home, which makes me think that what I'm hearing doesn't sound like an animal at all. This was a pretty surreal experience for me, and the few people that I've told agreed that perhaps someone was watching over me and warning me. A couple of years ago, I lived in a place close to the sea. At night, I used to take my dog down through the town center to the seafront for a nice walk. I eventually discovered that there was a small graveyard with gates on either side which I could cut through. I kind of like walking through graveyards, especially at night, because it is creepy in a very cool kind of way. I did this quite a lot, and never once felt afraid. However, one night I was walking up to the gates, and I felt the strongest feeling of dread. No reason for it. Nothing was different. But it was like something was screaming at me to not go through. Do not walk through the graveyard tonight. I didn't. I turned around and went the other way. It was such a bizarre sensation, given that before I had walked there plenty of times without meeting anyone, with nothing happening. I genuinely believe that if I had ignored that and walked on through, something would have happened. Who knows what, or what was lurking there that night. I never went that way again. Some people have told me that I had a guardian angel who was warning me of the danger. A few years back, I had gone out with some friends to the mountains for a camping trip. And by camping trip, I mean everybody gets drunk or high around a fire in the middle of the woods and then passes out in their trucks. I was always the youngest of the friend group, and this took place before I found my taste for mind-altering substances. I'm typically something of a skeptic, and if this had happened nowadays, I'd probably blame it on being drunk. But I was stone cold sober the whole time, which is why I feel so sure of what I saw. We're all out at the campsite, maybe 10 or 15 of us. I'm sitting on someone's tailgate smoking a cigarette when my friend, let's call him John, comes up to me clearly intoxicated. John was the one who I came out to the campsite with, and probably my closest friend out of anyone there. He asked me if I wanted to go on an adventure with him in the woods. I figured that if nothing else, I should probably go with him just to make sure that he didn't drunkenly fall over and hurt himself. Not to mention that even though I didn't drink or do any drugs back then, didn't mean that I was opposed to fun adventures into the forest. So we walked past the tree line that surrounded the campfire and into the dense trees. The moon was out, and it was a pretty clear night, so although it wasn't dark, it wasn't pitch black. We came to a clearing that seemed to be made of flattish boulders and rocks. We were looking up at the night sky, and John was drunk talking, and I was listening and nodding along with whatever nonsense he was saying. He took a seat on one of the flatter rocks, and eventually just laid down and passed out. I tried to jostle him awake, but he just kept mumbling for me to let him rest a while. Since this is usually how John behaves when he's drinking, I complied, and figured I'd head back to the campsite and check on him again in a little bit. I go back, talk to a few people, smoke a few cigarettes, and then decide to go and check on him. Maybe 10 minutes have passed. I'm walking back to the clearing where I left him, and already from afar noticed that he wasn't in the same spot. I kept going, figuring that he must have gotten up and wandered off somewhere. As I'm walking, I notice a shadow in the shape of a human standing behind a shrub of sorts a few feet to my right. I stop, figuring that it was John messing with me. I said, "Dude, come on, let's go back to the camp." No response. Then I gave him the stereotypical, "Please, you're not scaring me." Still nothing. I moved closer to the shadow and noticed that I couldn't make out any distinguishable features. No shirt logo, no eyes, or any face for that matter. Just a vacuum of black that stood in the shape of a man, hanging out with me in the forest. I backed away, putting it all together that it wasn't John, and I ran back to camp. I checked the truck that John and I drove out there in, and he was sleeping on the bench seat. I did a quick head count, and everyone that I had recalled being at the camp was still there. The only thing that convinces me that this was paranormal was just the sheer absence of light that this thing took the shape of. Just pure darkness. Whenever I tell this story, John always gets chills, imagining that this thing was probably out there with him when he was passed out alone. The general conclusion was that John had stumbled back while I had left him, and I just didn't notice that he had returned. Like I said, I'm a skeptic, so I always try to rationalize these things. But this is the one experience that I've had that I just can't believe was simply my eyes playing tricks on me. I've heard of shadow people, but I always thought those were just what people saw during sleep paralysis. Not out in the wilderness, and not while fully awake. This happened in October of 2019. So it was a weekend, and I figured it would be a good idea to get out of town for the day and introduce my girlfriend to my mom for the first time. She lives out on the plains on 40 acres. The house and land are a fourth of a mile off the road into the field, with our long driveway dividing the land of two neighbors. We arrived around noon, and my brother and his wife also happened to be out there visiting that day, so I introduced the girlfriend to everyone and the dogs. I noticed that the loudest and most obnoxious dog, the beagle, didn't come to greet us, and my mom explained that the previous night she went to grab something from the truck, and on her way in the dog had darted out the door and ran off into the field, and still hadn't come back. This isn't all that uncommon for a dog to run off in the night and come back a couple of days later. Later that day, my mom recalls that her and my nieces were woken up around 1 a.m. to all the dogs howling and barking non-stop, just going nuts. Eventually they stop, and everyone gets to go back to sleep. We continue to have a nice quiet day out in the middle of nowhere for a few more hours, when we notice that this hawk has been flying around the same spot all day in the field. So my brother and his wife go to check it out, while I mess around doing something else. A few minutes later, my brother comes back and tells me he found the missing beagle, but something is wrong. I should go check it out before telling my mom. I follow my brother out into the field, expecting to find a dead dog. As we were walking, I see a spot of blood and think it was probably coyotes. He shows me a trail of blood that leads to a larger puddle and another trail. The dog seems to have been drug around some. The trail led to an area in the field where the dog lay. As soon as I saw the dog, something looked wrong about the scene. All the plants around him were trampled, and something looked different about him. I took a few more steps, and I realized that he was missing skin. This wasn't just a few bits missing from a fight or birds picking at him. The only fur or skin left on him was his head, tail, and paws, with very distinguished straight lines where he had been skinned. Some sick fuck had killed, skinned, and taken the pelt of our dog in the middle of the night, only a couple of 100 feet from the front door. Of course we called the cops. They took 2 hours to arrive. They took pictures. We looked around the area and noticed tire tracks, but we couldn't tell how old they were. We also found a pile of horse shit that looked pretty fresh close by. Did whoever did this ride a horse out there? To this day, the cops have never followed up with anything, and nothing else has happened. Nature cams were installed and fences have been mended so dogs can't get out, but we still have no idea who did it. I came across the pictures on my phone today and can't seem to bring myself to delete them. I live in Lompoc, California. I also live across the street from the cemetery. I used to hop the fence on one side of the cemetery to go to a friend's house who lived on the opposite side of it. If I went around, it would easily be a 4 to 5 block walk to her house. The keeper of the grounds who lived there called the cops on me several times, so I stopped. I also have been driving for years now, so there's no need anymore. Anyways, on one of my walks, I noticed a tree house in the cemetery off to the side. It was in a trench in a deep wooded area. There's been a few nights when I've gone and hung out inside of this tree house with a few friends. However, every time I went, I would see spirits. I was scared many times, but seeing my friends happy and enjoying themselves was what made everything worth it. Except for one night in December of 2018 when I had brought new friends with me. During this time I was going through a lot and kind of hanging out with a bad group of people, some of whom were with me that night. Like I've mentioned, I always at least see something, but usually only for a few seconds. This time, though, I saw a rather large man, kind of burly yet completely transparent. I felt him before I actually saw him, how sad and lost he was. But I could also feel how gentle that his soul was, and that he was only looking for help or just someone to understand. Since I could feel him, I started hearing footsteps breaking twigs, leaves, and such. After the initial feeling, I started hearing footsteps breaking twigs, leaves, and such. My friends heard it too. I looked over, and I saw this man, and all I could feel was how confused that he was. He started to walk up, but froze once I saw him. I yelled out to him that it was okay and that we weren't going to hurt him. I told him that it was safe for him to be there if he wanted to stick around, but then my friends wanted to leave with how freaked out that they were. I walked out first to be his guide, and he walked in front of me until he disappeared seconds later. I don't think I really helped him, considering that I didn't have much chance being with that group of friends and all, but I could feel just how gentle that he was, like I said. Sometimes I feel that gentle presence whenever I visit the graveyard, and I think of him. Today I went, because today is also the anniversary of me losing a friend. I felt that gentle presence when I visited her grave today. I want to preface this by saying that I generally consider myself to be a rather skeptical person, and have written off most of cryptozoology and paranormal stuff as straight up bunk until this event. I try to see if there's a realistic reasoning behind most encounters and stories, if that makes sense. Now, let's get to the meat and potatoes of this story. It was the late summer of 2005 in Northeast Ohio. I was heading into my junior year of high school. I was spending the night over at my best friend's house, and we decided for the hell of it to just go crash outside for the night, with just sleeping bags. It was a peaceful enough evening. The weather was nice, balmy, kind of warm, and the air rang with the pleasant symphony of crickets and far-off spring peepers. Skies couldn't have been more clear. as it was that special sort of feeling in the air where you were far enough away from the last time it rained that the air didn't feel heavy anymore, and actually felt inviting instead of humid and miserable. This was as close to a picturesque summer evening as you could get. Everything was blanketed in the dark blue elegance of the evening light. Falling asleep was easy enough. This was a year that mosquitoes were remarkably in pretty low numbers, making sleeping unprotected with just a sleeping bag simple for once. Eventually, as bad luck would have it, I had to answer the call of nature, so I was roused from sleep to do so. My buddy's yard was a fairly large-sized one with an area of woods bordering most of it. After finishing, I staggered back over to my sleeping bag and noticed that my friend was not in his. We were staged a few feet apart in case a bear came and got someone in the middle of the night or something. It would leave enough time for the other one to run to safety. You know, bro stuff. In any case, I catch him in my peripheral vision just kind of standing along the side of a shed that was in his yard. I wasn't kidding when I said that this night was picturesque. The sky was so unnaturally clear that the starlight and what little of the crescent moon we had left led to quite a bit of light despite being in the dead of the night itself. However, the area where we chose to pee, with the shed included, happened to be nestled along the part of the yard that was the thickest with trees, leading to a large portion of the yard still being under heavy shadow. Kind of funny to think about, isn't it? Having a well-defined area of shade in the dead of night when you expect everything to be dark. Oh, have I mentioned that at this point it was also suspiciously quiet? The idyllic chirping of the frogs and crickets that had earlier ushered me to sleep was now nowhere to be heard. I hadn't realized it when I first woke up to do my business, but it was quiet the whole time since I had woken up. Honestly, the fact that it was so quiet may have been why I woke up in the first place, on top of answering nature's call. Focusing my attention back on my friend, I'm noticing that he's still standing by the shed. He was around the corner away from me, so I had to approach him from behind, and thankfully it seemed he was going to be done using the bathroom. And thankfully it seemed he was done going to the bathroom as his pants were up. "Hey, what are you doing just standing around there?" I ask as I circle around and approach to his left. I didn't even need to wait for an answer before I immediately saw what had him frozen. Roughly about 30 feet away, hidden among the thickest area of forest in the yard, way back behind the shed, it stood. I'm not the greatest with words, so please bear with me as I try my best to describe what befell my eyes. This creature was perhaps a few inches taller than myself, and I was 6 foot at the time. However, that's where the similarities end. It stood on 2 legs with a hunched posture, as it appeared to have had its shoulders raised up with its head leaning slightly forward. It had arms, but the forearms were a bit longer than the upper arms, culminating into sickly-looking hands ending in long points, almost like claws. Though bathed in starlight and shadow, I could discern the skin of the beast was about a dark blue, dark grayish color. The head itself was mostly obscured by the shadows, but retained a general humanoid appearance. I couldn't make out a mouth or a jaw, but the most unnerving thing about it was that its eyes glowed red. Well, perhaps glowed is a bit of a sensationalist term. It actually looked more like the red eye effect from old photos. However, it definitely illuminated the area immediately around the eye sockets. So perhaps illuminate is the better term. This creature was so sickeningly frail and thin in build that there was no way it could have been a neighbor fucking with us, as it didn't even seem physically possible for something so thin to even be able to support weight on such a frame. And then it started moving. At this point, my fight-or-flight response told me to go screw myself, and I stood frozen in fear, just like my friend. The beast, already a horrific bastardization of the human form, now grotesquely bobbed its body up and down, as if attempting to take off in flight. I didn't notice it before, but there appeared to be a sort of cape behind its back. Though I say cape, it appeared to be of a ragged, fleshy texture, as if the skin on its back was flayed off and was dragging behind its arms. This sickening flesh cape waved with each flap of its arms, giving the illusion of wings. But that wasn't even the worst part. It emitted a noise. This wasn't a growl or a roar, or even a scream. The sound it made was akin to a raspy inhale, like someone deeply out of breath. However, it still wasn't quite like that. There was like a sort of reverb to its breathing. It echoed quietly, yet still managed to be one of those sounds that you feel in your bones, each graveling breath raking its claws into your very soul as you're already frozen in horror. This dance felt like it went on for hours, but in reality it was only a few brief moments that passed. Our bodies finally made enough adrenaline that we were able to bolt and sprint to his house. We talked about it a few days later, but after a point just didn't feel like reliving it anymore. Until we researched what cryptids were and settled on the idea we came across, and decided that people would think we were just full of it, and decided to not bother talking about it at all. To this day, I still don't know what I encountered, but this experience has subconsciously kept me terrified of being in wooded areas after dark for all these years. In fact, last weekend my wife and kids and I were camping at a state campground, and it was the first time I had been outside at night in the woods since that day, and I was scared all night long. Thankfully nothing happened, and we had a nice weekend. But it's crazy that this experience has affected me for so long. My wife was the only other person I shared this experience with, and at first she laughed it off, thinking I was kidding, until she saw how solemn that I got when I talked about it, and could see that it clearly was not a joke to me. She then confided in me that she's experienced her own paranormal things, so that's fun too. Superficially, I would say it resembled what people have described as the Mothman, but I never actually saw it take flight, and the eyes didn't glow nearly as bright as reports made it out to be. Also, the wings only looked like wings when it was flapping its arms, and I doubt that it could have actually flown with those raggedy skin flaps. But I'm definitely not going to be trying to figure it out. The only other guess was some kind of crawler, maybe, but I never saw it make any other action aside from the bobbing and arm waving. I have an attic in my house, and ever since I was young, I hated going up there. It was dark, because there was no light, and it was always absolutely freezing. It had a really bad energy, and my anxiety would skyrocket whenever I had to go up there with my dad. It felt like someone had set a timer, and time was running out, if that makes sense. It was like I had to get out of there ASAP, or something would happen. In 2016, my parents decided to convert the attic and make it into their bedroom. After this happened, I noticed a lot of unexplainable events. One day I was off from school and I was home alone. I was lying on my bed watching Jeremy Kyle show clips with both of my cats on the bed with me. Then I heard what sounded like someone walking down the stairs from the attic. It's a very distinct sound, and I knew it was the stairs creaking as they were new and didn't normally make any noise. I paused the video and listened. I didn't hear anything, so I continued watching, now a little on edge. 2 minutes later, I heard the footsteps again. Peanut, my cat, started hissing and meowing and went to the end of my bed and hid. At this point, I was tearing up. I somehow managed to get out of bed and pull my dresser in front of my door. I sat in front of the door and called my dad, sobbing. I explained to him what was happening and he said, "Go out of my room and look." Hell no. I begged him to call my neighbors to come in and get me. It was only after I called my dad 5 times, he kept hanging up on me, that he called my neighbors. One of my neighbors, who have a key, came in. I flew down the stairs, sobbing and shaking. My neighbor checked the house, but no one was there. I didn't feel safe staying home for weeks after this. My best friend and I would hang out after school at my house most days, and whenever we did, we would always hear noises from upstairs. One time in particular, we were in the kitchen making noodles, and we heard banging. I assumed it was my cat and didn't think much of it. My friend then shushed me and said to listen. From upstairs I could hear the sound of someone opening and closing a chest of drawers and slamming my wardrobe open and shut. Now my cats are loud, but how on earth does a cat open up a drawer? It's a very distinct sound. We ended up waiting in my back garden holding a paint scraper and a knife until my dad came home. This is by far one of the scariest ones. My dad called up the stairs to me and said he was going to the shops. Once he left, I went downstairs to grab some food. I asked my sister if she wanted anything to eat, and she said yes. She was in the front room, so I was talking to her from the kitchen. My dad knocked on the door, and I yelled at her to get it. She didn't. I went to answer it, giving it to her for being lazy. When I opened the door, in came my dad and my sister. After months of noises, banging, hearing people talking and walking around when I was home alone, I was sick of it. I felt anxious to be in my own home, and I had other things to worry about. So one day I decided to try to talk to whatever it was that was in my house. I didn't use a Ouija board. I just sat on my stairs and had a chat, I guess. I told him that I respect that they were in this house before I was, but that they were scaring me and stressing me out. I asked if they would be able to leave or at least stop frightening me. After this, I've never had anything happen in my house. No banging or noises. I think that it was the spirits of the previous owners, a nice elderly couple who sadly died in the house of natural causes. It was my last year of college, and after getting dumped by my first significant girlfriend the year before, I ended up involved with a woman who lived next door. It was not a healthy relationship for either of us, but I think we cared for each other despite not always being good to each other, and we somehow stayed involved for like a year. One morning while we were brushing our teeth and getting ready for the day at her place, she mentioned a video assignment due in a couple of days. She grew up in a large city and was unfamiliar with the sleepy New England region that we went to college in, but she knew that I had gone to high school about an hour away and had family in the area, so she was hoping that I might be able to suggest somewhere interesting to get footage. I suggested that my parents were buried in a pretty cemetery near the high school in town, and that I hadn't stopped to pay my respects for a bit, so I'd be happy to drive her over there after classes. She liked the idea, and we agreed to meet up in the afternoon, grab some dinner, and go by the graveyard so that she could take her footage. Only we kind of screwed up. It was probably late fall by that point, and the days were getting noticeably shorter. If I remember right, service was slow at the restaurant too. By the time we were getting into my hand-me-down Dodge Grand Caravan to head out to the graveyard, the sun was going down. Not ideal for shooting some quick, amateur footage for video class. As I said, the graveyard was near the high school, which was a little outside the town proper. You passed the school, and then there was this windy road kind of into the woods and up a sizable hill or small mountain overlooking their football field. About halfway up, there was a turn off into the cemetery. It was a peaceful little spot, and my grandparents had plots next to each other. I had visited a lot in the daytime in my first couple of years of college. My grandmother had passed away when I was in high school, but my grandfather lived on a few more years until passing away early into my first years of college. Since I was nearby, I visited him a fair bit as his health began to decline, and in retrospect, I really value those opportunities to spend some one-on-one time with him, even if I feel a little guilty for not appreciating it at the time. I was a snotty 19-year-old and didn't realize what a cool guy that he actually was, and how lucky that I was to be part of his life in that way. After he died, I continued to stop by the cemetery several times a year to check on their grave sites and pay my respects. I had been to the cemetery a lot, but never after sundown. There were two entrances. The main one that took you through the center of the graveyard, and a side entrance that led out onto a little road, just big enough for one car that was a straight shot to my grandparents' plots. To the left of this little gravel road was an open field with newer-looking graves, and to the right was a more overgrown area with older-looking headstones, and the real tree line for the woods beyond that. Even in daytime, because of the brush and the shade from the trees, it always looked dim off that way, and my sister and I had both remarked about how it was kind of creepy over there. So this woman I was seeing and I were driving to the cemetery at sundown, just hoping that we'd be able to get in and figure out how to get some footage for her assignment. The main gate was locked, but the side entrance was open, which was better for us anyways, since it was the more direct route to my grandparents' graves. I pulled the minivan in slowly, careful to stay off the grass as much as possible, and we stopped and got out at the intersection nearest to where my grandparents were buried. She got the camera she had checked out from the school's library equipment room, and was trying to get some footage of the headstones or something while I walked over to say hi to my grandparents. Only it was too dark, and after a couple of minutes she asked if I would turn the headlights on to see if the light would help her get something usable. Not knowing how long we'd be out there, and not wanting to drain the battery, I decided to just go ahead and turn on the engine, too. After a few more minutes, the van started acting weird. It wasn't a new vehicle. My parents had bought it before I was in high school and had given it to me years before, so I was pretty familiar with the sound of the engine idling. That night in the graveyard, the engine began to make unfamiliar noises. It was very high-pitched and loud for an idling vehicle. That immediately raised concern for me because the last thing that I wanted was for the van to break down in the middle of the cemetery where we may or may not have been trespassing. I started to walk back toward the van to investigate. As I walked toward it, though, the headlights began to flicker rapidly. It was sort of an inconsistent strobing effect, which was like a what the heck kind of thing. They had never done that before, and never did it after. Same with the engine noise. Then I heard something even more disturbing. To my side, off in the wooded area with the older graves, something started moving around in the brush. I looked, and in the darkness, I swear, I saw movement to accompany the sound. I couldn't see what it was too dark, but something was coming slowly towards us out of those woods. I instantly felt as if it was time to go, and that we shouldn't be there. Fortunately, my companion agreed, even though she hadn't got enough footage, because she heard the approaching rustling as well. We got into the van, which continued to sound really weird, but thankfully it went into gear and drove normally as we got the hell out of there. The lights stopped flickering as I got turned around, and the engine sound returned to normal as we approached the gate. The most rational explanation for the rustling was an animal, but that didn't explain the van acting so strangely. I kept it for another 6 months before trading it in, and it never made noise like that while idling again, and the headlights were always reliable, never flickering. I also have had other strange experiences in my life. But this was the first and only time I ever felt that overwhelming sense that I had to leave or that I shouldn't be somewhere. I can't help but wonder if both my sister and I had always thought that wooded spot off to the right was spooky for a good reason, and if I might have found out what that reason was had my companion and I stayed for a few more minutes that night. I work on oil rigs. I have ever since I was 20, and I'm 33 now. In 2007, I was working for Nomac Drilling. They have since sold out to Patterson, and we were drilling in the Haynesville for natural gas. Anyone who works on rigs knows that the work can take you way off the beaten path from what normal civilization is used to. Some places, you're on ranch roads for an hour before you reach the location, and others you're driving on roads canopied by trees in the backwoods of Louisiana. This happened to me in the latter. We were rigging down after finishing a well, and we were on our last night of the 7-day hitch. About halfway through our 12-hour tower. We had pretty much finished, and were making sure everything was tied down securely for the rig move. We killed the light plants, and the driller let us knock off early. This area was accessible outside Houghton, Louisiana, and the lease was actually on the back of the Barksdale AF base, but we had to leave the way we came in. Driving home at 2 a.m. seemed pretty normal at first, and I made it to the blacktop with no issues. The blacktop was still canopied by trees, and other than the lights from my truck, everything was pitch black. Out of nowhere, still basically in the middle of nowhere, this thing appears almost close enough to get hit on my driver's side. Okay, weird. But even more strange, he was leaning at what I swear was an impossible angle for someone to not tip over. Its hands were stretched, reaching towards my truck, and what I could see of the face was morbid and twisted. The hairs on the back of my neck raised, and I gasped it to speed back closer to society. It was about a 2-hour drive home, and I felt off for the rest of the trip. More oddly, I was working over on a separate occasion with one of the crews that work when I'm home, and another hand was talking about a very similar, if not identical, experience. I don't know who or what I saw, and the face could have been a blur from relative distance, speed, and the time I actually saw them. But who is out that late, and why? If someone was broken down, I could see them trying to flag me. But this didn't seem to be the case here.
Strange storm drain encounter. Hello, Internet. I recently had a strange encounter with something in a storm drain and would like to see if you guys could help identify what it was. What happened? Okay. So I work at a movie theater, which means we closed the building down at about 1:30, 2 a.m. So once the building was closed, a couple of co-workers and I decided to go to a hill across town that had a view of Nashville. We hiked up the hill, and once we got to the halfway point, they headed back to the car to drive up the hill faster, and I continued up alone. When I got to the top, a guy was hiding in a bush and shouted, "What are you doing here?" at me and started to run after me. Now, I know you're probably wondering where the creature comes in, and that is about to be revealed. So I ran down the opposite side of the hill towards a church and lost the guy tailing me. He went after my coworkers instead. As I reached the bottom of the hill, I found an open drainage pipe for the storm drains. It had bars covering the front at about 1 foot 6 inches apart, and decided to hide down there. I made a couple of turns and ended up about 3 or 4 streets from where I went in. The drain was about 5 feet high, so I could move quickly with only a little bit of a hunch. I decided I was going to wait a little bit to make sure I was safe, so I took my phone out and started to scroll through social media. After about 15 minutes or so, I heard what sounded like a rock getting kicked down the tunnel coming from deeper in. So I turned my phone's flashlight on to investigate and saw a pair of eyes reflecting back just on the edge of the light. The eyes were about 6 inches from the top of the tunnel. The rest of its body was in mostly darkness, but I could tell it was human-shaped. But I wasn't sure if it was bending over like I was, or if it was a shorter creature with a big head. We stared at each other for what felt like a minute, and it started moving quickly toward me again. Once it started moving, I took off back the way I came and ran to the church where my friends were waiting for me, and we left pretty quickly after that. I haven't been back to that hill since, but my coworkers and I are planning to all go down the drain together on Halloween just to see what happens.
I always visit my son at the cemetery, usually at night. I love how peaceful it is there, and just look at the clear, starry sky. Today has been a rough day for me. I cried and prayed on my way to the cemetery. First, I noticed how bright that the moon is tonight. I usually have to use my phone's flashlight so that I could see where I'm going. Not tonight. My son has a toy box on his grave. Letters, books, and toys are inside. It's a little plastic tote. The lid wasn't there when I got there tonight. It was on the ground. Today's weather wasn't really nice. Everything must be wet, I thought. But no. The card and the letter that's sitting on the very top were dry. The teddy bear was dry. It couldn't have been the wind because the papers were there. I don't know if someone opened it and left it open, or something else. Nothing was taken, and nothing was moved. Tonight, I'm sitting here at the cemetery, totally at peace. This happened around 13 years ago when I was a sophomore in college attending a liberal arts school in Suffolk County, New York. Within the first month or two of freshman year, I had found myself in a very tight-knit group of fellow theater geeks, 6 guys, myself included, and 1 girl. And they all loved horror movies and ghost stories. I had found my crew. Freshman year was tough, but we all held each other up and made the whole experience more enjoyable for one another. At the beginning of sophomore year, we decided that in October, as the Halloween season was ramping up, we would find a creepy, wooded spot in a nearby town some night and scare the crap out of ourselves. We did some research and found that there was a particularly isolated area about 30 minutes away, infamous for paranormal sightings. Perfect. The 7 of us split into 2 different cars and headed out into the night. Allow me to set the scene. You turn off of a very busy main road, flooded with strip malls and restaurants and whatnot, and you're almost immediately greeted by complete darkness. Again, this area was very heavily wooded. It was essentially a large web of winding roads surrounded by trees. Very few streetlights and very few houses. Without a GPS or a good sense of direction, one could easily get lost in there. We all made sure to have fully charged phones and flashlights just in case, but the goal was to keep driving until we collectively decided to pull over and go exploring. So, per the directions, we made a left off of the main road, driving about 30 minutes or so into this dark network, picking directions at random, just getting intentionally lost. Our cars made a turn and, to our surprise, there was a huge log in front of us. We had reached a dead end of some kind, with nothing but trees beyond it. We all got out to see exactly what this was, stepped over the log, and noticed 2 narrow trails leading off in different directions. This seemed like as good a time as any to grab our flashlights and do some amateur ghost hunting. We flipped a coin and set off on the trail to the right. The trail was so narrow that we had to walk single file to avoid getting whacked by branches. For whatever reason, I ended up in the back. I'm usually pretty rational and level-headed, but I have to say, the further we went in, the more I was overcome with an uneasy feeling. I kept hearing sounds deep in the woods, unable to shake the sense that we were being watched. But I seemed to be the only one who heard these things, so I shrugged it off as my imagination. In any case, the whole point of us being there was to get scared, not to mention the fact that we were 7 able-bodied college students. What would we come across that could take us down? We headed down this trail for about 20 minutes, and just when I thought it would never end, we came to a massive clearing. And I mean massive. It was a large, open field of unkempt grass. Comparable in scope to a golf course, but not nearly as well manicured. The trees surrounded the entire field, which was so large we could not see the end of it from where we were standing. I was so thrilled to get out of that narrow trail, but I don't think any of us were expecting to find an area so vast. One of us looked to the right and said, "Hey, check that out." We all turned and there was an old, dilapidated house several hundred yards away. The house was completely dark with no cars or signs of anyone actually living there. We walked over and shined our flashlights at it, and sure enough, the windows and doors were all boarded up. I peered between the boards on one of the windows, and what I could see was an old white couch covered in plastic, but an otherwise empty room. Whoever used to live there, they were long gone. Because there was no way in, and because we all felt sufficiently creeped out by the house anyway, we all decided to walk closer to the trail we had come in from, have a seat in the field, and figure out where to go next. We walked back towards the narrow trail, but before we could sit, my friend Mark stopped what he was doing. His expression dropped, and he pointed. We all turned, and on a very far side of the field, directly across from where we had come in, we could see someone tall, lanky, and pale dancing among the trees. By dancing, I mean that it was skipping around, grabbing a tree, swinging around it, and then doing the same thing to another one. Basically kind of like a do-si-do type motion. The moon was so bright, and the woods were so dark. It actually took a second for us to really understand what we were looking at. Jay, the 6'4" skeptic of the group, wasn't seeing it. I leaned into him, pointed in that direction, and said, "Jay, look where I'm pointing. Don't you see that?" He squinted a bit, and the second that he did see it, he gasped with everything that he had, clutched my arm, and whispered, "What the fuck is that?" What happened next sent shockwaves through all of us. Whoever it was, they stopped dancing, looked in our direction, and started charging straight at us. Without even thinking, we freaked and ran back to the trail. Yet again, Jay was the only one who didn't see what was happening. He shouted after us, "Guys, what is it? Where are you going?" After about 15 seconds of running like hell, I heard Jay scream, "Holy shit!" I looked back and saw his flashlight following the rest of us into the trail. While the walk into the woods took about 20 minutes, we made it back to our 2 cars, hopped in, and were peeling away and closer to 5. Once we were at a safe distance, we pulled over, got out, and checked in with each other about what had just happened. My heart was pounding, and I knew everyone else was feeling the same way. Nearly 15 years later, we are all still friends, living in different states yet keeping in touch through marriages, divorces, children, etc. But occasionally, out of the blue, one of us will send a group text to the others, something to the effect of, "The woods. That really happened, right?" It most certainly did. That experience is always in the back of my mind, and I'm pretty sure it always will be. Here's the thing that still resonates with me about that night. Whoever that was, they were dancing maniacally in the woods at 1 in the morning, and then ran directly for a group of young adults, not at all fazed by the fact that they were severely outnumbered. Did that thing know we were there from the second we parked? Was it the sound that I kept hearing when we walked the trail? Whatever the case may be, when he came for us that night, you can be sure none of us wanted to stick around to see what he was truly capable of. Before the pandemic, I was visiting West Canada, just exploring caves, when I'm pretty deep inside of one, perhaps 70 meters in. I get to this pretty tall section of cavern, and then I hear it, a scuffling noise. I put it off, thinking that it was just some rocks moving. I turn off my headlamp, and then I see them. These two glowing eyes. Glowing yellow eyes. So I turned my lamp on again, and what I saw this time was terrible. There was this grayish thing. It looked humanoid, but its arms and legs were too long and splayed out weirdly. Its claws were long, and they looked like they could easily slice through Kevlar. Its teeth were long as well. Its skin was super tight around its ribs and spine. I could see its bones. It screeched a horrible noise. I had to cover my ears. I look back, and it's gone. But I hear this low growl. Well, I felt it more than I heard it. So I start slowly heading back, and it starts moving toward me. So I start running. Pretty close to the exit, I could see the sunset. I felt its breath on me. As soon as I reached the exit, though, it pulled back. Bystanders said they saw it too, that it ran away like lightning. I'm never going to those caves again.
It's been about 8 months since this incident. I still remember it clearly. It was around 10 o'clock in the morning. My mom was in the bathroom taking a bath, so we can say that I was the only person in the house with my dog. I was feeling thirsty, so I went to the kitchen to get a glass of water, and my dog followed. When I turned around after drinking the water, I saw a shadow figure. It was completely opaque, pitch dark, and had a full humanoid form. It ran from the gallery in the room that was parallel to me. At that moment, my dog started barking wildly and ran into the same room. I had a pug, and we all know pugs don't usually bark that much, but at that moment he was barking too much. I froze, wondering what to do, and when I came back to my senses I sprinted, took my dog, and locked myself into a room. Even after locking ourselves in, my dog was still growling. When my mother came out, we checked the whole house, but we couldn't find anyone. 2 months after that incident, my dog died. My friends and I used to camp a lot in the El Dorado National Forest. We had a spot along Sopiago Springs we used to camp at a lot. One weekend we decided to go for a 3-day foraging trip. We brought in MREs in case we couldn't find anything, some guns, and some supplies to set up shelter, but that's about it. The first night was chill. We cooked a bunch of crawdads and a squirrel my buddy shot, drank a few beers we'd brought, and slept fine. Next day, something felt weird to me. One of my friends who was with me and I had had some really creepy experiences in this part of the forest in the past.
and it felt a bit like those. Forest was dead silent, and you felt like something was watching you. I grew up in the woods, so I know the signs of a predator, but this felt different than a bear or a mountain lion. When night fell, my friends went 200 yards or so up the stream to do some stuff, and I was alone at the campsite. The feeling got even stronger, so I built up the fire nice and big and grabbed a gun. I kept hearing faint voices from the woods in the opposite direction from where my friends had went. They were low and distinct sounds, but they were creeping me out majorly, and my buddies had taken the only 2 flashlights. Poor planning in hindsight. As I peered out into the darkness, I caught a glimpse of something moving 50 yards or so out into the trees. I snapped the rifle to my shoulder and got the scope on it. It was pretty dark, and the only light was from the fire, but I could see the outline of what I was aiming at. It looked human, but was on all 4s, and its arms seemed a lot longer than they should have been. It stood a bit like an ape, but very low to the ground. I only saw it for a second before it loped off deeper into the woods. After I lost track of it, I'd hear light rustling in different directions around the camp, leaves scuffling, the occasional twig breaking. Always away from where my friends went, 180 degrees on the other side of the camp from their departure. I got the sense that whatever it was stalking me. I kept the fire high and was staying sharp, looking out into the woods. But I didn't see it again. My buddies came back about 10 minutes later to find me a paranoid wreck glancing at the tree line with the scope. I told them what happened and they got quiet. Then told me the reason they came back when they did was they started hearing the same shit that I was hearing by where they were, and it had spooked them. We spent the second night of our trip with a big-ass fire and 3 lookouts. Nobody slept that night. In the morning, we broke camp as quick as we could and hightailed it out of there. We never camped in that spot again. I was driving with my daughter from Atlanta to South Carolina, and we were about 30 minutes away from home. I was very familiar with the area because I've traveled there countless times. As we passed by a church, my daughter said, "Did you see that lady?" I'm like, "What lady?" She explained that there was a woman walking among the tombstones in the graveyard. I'm like, "Let me turn around and see." Now, I had gone just a minute or so down the road before I turned around so that I was sure to see her. As we got to the church, I slowed down almost to the point of stopping, and there was no one. I turned around and actually stopped in front of the graveyard, and nobody was there. Now, this church was very isolated. There were no other houses for at least a mile or 2. We didn't see any cars that might have been broken down, and there were woods to the back of the church. Like I said, I know this area, so we think that it was the spirit of a woman who was buried there. You have to ask yourself, why in the hell would a woman be walking around in a graveyard at 3 a.m. in the morning? No houses for miles, no disabled car. Very spooky. By the way, my daughter sees spirits, and she's an empath.
I know that it sounds like a rabbit, but it wasn't. This happened about 2 hours ago. I stepped outside. This took place in southeastern Pennsylvania. The venue I was at to have a smoke when about 40 yards off in the distance I see this creature, sitting in a way I can only describe as like a gargoyle perched on a ledge. It clearly had arms and legs, and not just 4 legs like a rabbit or cat would. Its face was kind of hidden in the shadows of the night, but it kind of had a head shaped like a mouse from the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. It saw me and took these 2 kind of hops to its right, my left. and that's when I noticed its tail. It reminded me of a white-tailed deer's tail. Where the top was, it had dark silver or black fur, but right underneath it was white fur. It was a short tail also, not long like a cat or dog's tail. It just took those 2 hops and was gone. No noise, nothing. I just stood there, super puzzled. I saw it clear and unobstructed from objects until it hopped behind this house. If anyone has seen anything similar, I'd be happy to hear.
A few days ago, I started writing a script for a horror film. I was thinking about my experiences as a kid and what frightened me. The scariest thing that I remember is the first thing that came to mind, and also the most recent one that I can recall. When I was 7 or 8, in the middle of summer, I woke up in the middle of the night. I thought it was because I was cold, which was uncomfortably odd because it was summer, and my bedroom is upstairs and insulated. I moved my curtain aside to see if the window was open, but it was closed tight. While I was looking at the window, I noticed a man standing in the street. The street lamp was on his back, so I couldn't see his face, but he was looking toward our house. What I noticed was that he was very tall. I think now that he was probably around 6'7". It scared the crap out of me, so I pulled the curtain over the window and used the tacks from one of my posters to tack the curtain down, since the window didn't lock. I covered my head with my covers, because I knew that my dad would say it was a nightmare and give me a hug before sending me back to bed. I eventually did fall back asleep, but a few hours later, I woke up again. It was still very dark out, probably around 1 a.m. The first thing I noticed was my bedroom door was open, and I always shut my bedroom door because I'm a very private person. I got out of bed and went to go to the bathroom. I made sure as I was leaving the bathroom to close my door. Once I was done, as I was going up the stairs, I noticed that my door was open. At this point, I was pretty freaked out. I went into my room, and my heart dropped into my stomach. My bedspread was torn from my bed. The sheets were strewn across the floor. All my pictures and posters were taken off the walls, and the dresser was emptied onto my bed. I went into my sister's room because it was right across the hall. I felt even worse when I did this because she was fast asleep and all the papers had been pulled out of her desk. I woke her up, shaking her as hard as I could. I told her what had happened, and we both ran downstairs to my dad's room. He helped us search the house, but we didn't find anything. Nothing had been taken, and my sister and I's rooms were the only ones that had been trashed. We both slept in the living room for a few days, because it was by my dad's room, but nothing happened, so we went back to life as normal, and eventually forgot about it. Until now. When I was about 4, I went to the local cemetery with my aunt. She went there often to take pictures because there were some pretty spots there. She was taking photos of my cousins and I ran off, and when they realized I was missing, they yelled for me. I came back and they asked where I had been, and I said that I had been playing with my friend Angel, and that I would take them to her grave. I did, and even though I couldn't read, I told them details about her that I wouldn't have known unless I had been able to read her headstone. Since then I've looked into the girl and found out that she's the sister of some people around my age, who I know in my town. She was 4 when she died. I still look for her headstone every time I go to the cemetery, even today. I get sleep paralysis, and it's always the same thing. A pair of young twins would appear. One was in a little dress and pigtails, the other with suspenders and slacks. They never talked, let alone gave me their names, so I called them Tammy and Tucker. They had black skin. Not like African American skin, but black as the night, barely more than a living shadow, with yellow eyes that flickered. The way that they moved was just freaky. They changed positions with my every blink, like a weeping angel, or SCP-173. For the first hour, or 5 blinks after I woke up, there was nothing but the darkness of my room. Then my vision would get slightly lighter, like I had an invisible nightlight that just lit up my whole room. On the next blink, my closet door would open, with a little clawed hand peeping out like it had been in the middle of clawing its way out of the dark depths of my closet. On the next, a hand would appear on the floor under my bed, and the one in my closet would be a full arm. My bed had about a foot of space under it, so I imagine a small child would have no trouble fitting underneath. On the next blink, the hand under my bed would be flipped, frozen in time in the middle of clawing at my bedsheets, and I would see Tammy's head poking out of my closet, staring at me. On the next blink, I would see Tucker's head poking out of the underside of my bed, and Tammy would have moved onto the ceiling, on all fours, her head broken around, just to stare at me. And then, on the next blink, Tucker's head would be upright, his chin resting on my bed, staring at me with his flickering eyes, and Tammy would be closer. On the next, Tucker would be at the foot of my bed, on his knees, staring at me, and I would be able to feel his weight. Tammy would be in the middle of my room. On the next, Tucker would be sitting on my thighs, and Tammy would be at my bedside. And on the final blink, I would see their mouths open almost as wide as their heads, revealing rows upon rows of pearly white teeth, curved like daggers, ready to sink into my flesh, so close to me that I could feel their breath, cold as ice, on my face. Then, with the last blink, they would be gone. No traces of them left, except for the bruises that appeared on my legs the following morning. One of the many reasons I would have trouble falling asleep is that once the paralysis started, my eyes wouldn't allow me to surpass the amount of time that the twins wanted me for, and I couldn't just rapidly blink for them to go away. It was as though my eyes were being held open against my will. Once the paralysis wore off, about 4 blinks after the twins left, I wouldn't be able to make a sound until I drifted off to sleep. When I was young, I lived in a small, one-story house in a bad community a little ways south of Atlanta, Georgia. My parents bought the house when there were no other houses in the neighborhood, save for 1 or 2 neighbors that weren't exactly close enough to really be counted as proper neighbors. Well, by the time that I had come along and gotten old enough to play outside on my own, there were way more houses. It wasn't a huge neighborhood or anything, but it was way more built up than when my parents originally moved there. Behind my house, there were some woods. The woods were pretty dense, and went on for a few miles before there was a middle school and its football field. Sometimes at night, if it was clear, you could see the stadium lights glow way beyond the tree line. Anyways, in these woods I discovered a creek. My parents told me that when they first moved here, there were all sorts of fish and crawdads living in there. But when I first discovered the creek, I found nothing except for maybe a few tiny minnows. maybe 5 or so spanning a mile, both up the creek from my house and down the creek. As I mentioned earlier, I didn't live in a very good area. The news was always talking about some shooting or drive-by, but where my neighborhood sat, it was usually more tame. This was in the early 2000s, and I didn't have internet or any sort of gaming console, but it was fine because I loved being outside anyways. Even if the mosquitoes were literally the worst, and I have a more severe allergic reaction to their bites. My favorite place to go and hide was out by the creek. But one time I went down, I remember seeing more vultures and scavenging birds flying around and sitting in the trees than normal. But no big deal. It was probably just a dead deer or something. I made my way to the creek and rolled up my jeans to stomp around in the water and kick up mud or whatever I used to do. But before I even finished rolling up my pants legs, I saw something. Still bent over, I was pretty close to a sickly pale, decently fresh-looking, human finger. It startled me for more than one reason, and I shot up like a rocket. There was nothing else around, though. No signs of other people, no blood, no body. Just a finger in the creek behind my house. It bothered me, but I was one of those weird, quiet kids, so it was a few months before I said anything. As it turns out, a few doors down there was a man hiding from the FBI in his sister's house. I never found out if he was an actual killer or anything, but I do remember waking up one night to see SWAT trucks and officers outside. One of the officers knocked on our door to ask my parents a few questions and to check to see if things were all right, and I remembered the finger. Of course, it was months later, so I doubted that it was still there and said nothing. I never heard anything else related to the guy, or the FBI, or the finger. But in my 8, maybe 9-year-old mind, it all seemed connected. And to this day, I'm pretty sure there was a murderer a few doors down from me when I was a kid.
My family and I moved into a new house. It used to have an attic, but it's been sealed off. After a couple of months into living in this house, sometimes I'm just watching TV and I hear scratching from the roof. I just play it off as a bird, as they're common where I live. After 3 weeks, the scratching has gotten worse and more frequent. It's like it's trying to scratch its way out of the roof. By the way, the attic entrance thing is above the outside of my sister's room. One day my sister tells my dad that the seal is open. My dad gets confused because it was supposed to be sealed off completely. My dad goes to close it and realizes that it's really hard to open and close, so whatever opened it was strong. That's when I start to get skeptical. The same night I go to get some snacks from the fridge, I open it to find out that they are all gone. I thought my siblings must have eaten them. In the morning, my parents are going on about a missing cake. The cake was supposed to be for my niece's birthday. They asked if I had anything to do with it, and I said no, along with all my other siblings. I was getting really suspicious about the attic, so I built up the courage to go and check it out. Note that I am probably the most paranoid person in the world, so I was scared for my life. But my curiosity got the best of me. I get the ladder, a torch, and a knife, just in case. I open the entrance. I shine my torch to see nothing. But as I search more, I see the cake, empty snack packets, dirty clothes, and a short, dark silhouette. It just freezes in place. Immediately I bolt and scream for my parents and tell them everything. They tell me to stay in my room. They go up and check, but there was no one there. I'm still shaken from that moment and get nightmares from it. We have since moved from that home and now live a normal, non-scary life.
My fiance first encountered this thing in 2013. He and his friends were on a camping trip up in the woods in Maine. Middle of nowhere, literally. No houses, nothing for miles. They had a small fire going, but due to the rain it was hard to keep it going. They kept hearing something trying to creep up on them. It was kind of noisy and sounded big, but was only on 2 feet. They started throwing rocks in the direction where they heard the footsteps coming from, and suddenly this thing let out a blood-curdling scream. Nothing any of them had ever heard before. He describes it as something that sounds like a fox, but slightly more human. It went crashing through the woods super clumsily, but kept trying to come back. They had to fend it off for most of the night. The second encounter was about 1.5 years later. He was out on a solo camping trip in Vermont, since that was something that he enjoyed. He heard the exact same blood-curdling scream that he had heard the first time. He was just sitting alone in the dark, looking at the stars with no fire or anything, when suddenly he heard the scream again. He quickly packed everything up and just went home. No hesitation. The third time was tonight. He was supposed to go out to my car to grab us a couple bottles of water when he heard the voices. Due to us recently having someone coming onto our property and stealing from our landlords, he went to investigate. He calls me and tells me to let the dog out. As he was sneaking around, the voices turned into a snarling sound. He quickly stopped, turning off his flashlight, and dropped to the ground. The dog was standing next to him. Suddenly he sees 2 glowing eyes, and it lunges at him. The dog gets excited and starts chasing it. The whole time they're chasing it, it's screaming and running faster than our dog. Even though he was running with a flashlight, he couldn't make out a shape of its body. He says by how far apart the eyes were, it seemed kind of big. He couldn't get a shape or color, besides where its body should be was a slight discoloration of the darkness around it. It kept looking back at him while he chased, and its eyes were just glowing while it screamed. Our dog chased it off into the woods, but luckily she came back. I think it was trying to lure him in by making it sound like voices, but the dog scared it. He said he couldn't get a height because the eye level kept changing from squatting to standing up, and then it started running. Has anyone experienced anything like this? Or knows what this animal or supernatural thing could be? I travel to many different cemeteries for work in Massachusetts. I'm a grave salesperson and go to these cemeteries on an as-needed basis. One day I was finishing up a sale and decided to use the bathroom in the tiny office shed in the back of the cemetery. The door to enter the office was locked, but the bathroom door was broken and wouldn't close all the way. I didn't care that the bathroom door wouldn't really close because no one was coming into the office anyway. It was late, and all the groundsmen had went home for the day. Just as I was finishing my business, the bathroom door slams shut, and since the knob was broken, the door just bounced and swung open. My first reaction was that someone had entered the office and the air pressure had sucked the door open. I run out and see that no one had come in. There were no open windows to cause a breeze. This door just slammed and opened all on its own. I was shaken up, but I still had some paperwork to complete. I acknowledged that there may be a presence in the room with me, but I didn't want to appear frightened of it. So I sat down in there for a few minutes and took my time finishing my work. Nothing has happened there since then, but I always acknowledge the entity as if it's watching over the place. My parents live on about 30 acres of wooded land in the middle of nowhere. I was in high school at this time and was up late on a weekend. I remember that I had fallen asleep in the recliner in our living room and woke up at around 2 a.m. I sat up and watched TV for about half an hour and then got up to get some water before going to bed. Our kitchen sink looked out over our backyard, and I could see clear to the tree line because of a lamp on a telephone pole that we had installed for security. As I looked out, I saw something dash across the tree line for about 50 feet before going back into the trees. I can still see it in my mind. It was either a white or really pale gray, and looked like a person moving on all fours. There was no visible fur or clothing. I could tell it was large, at least the size of a person, maybe larger. It covered the 50-foot span in between 5 and 10 seconds. I was absolutely frozen in place for a solid minute after this encounter. My parents kept telling me that it was just an albino coyote. I know it wasn't. A few years later, I came across a YouTube video talking about really strange creatures caught on trail cameras. It was one of those low-quality edits that pop up on your recommended videos after a long video binge. Halfway through came an image that made my blood go cold. It was called a rake. This was exactly what I had seen. To this day, I will swear by it that I saw this creature, and still refuse to be outside at night at my parents' house. My dad used to work at a homeless shelter. He usually helped them find jobs and things like that. When I had to go with him, they left me in a room with a bunch of Disney VHS movies with some printout coloring pages and a bunch of colored pencils. So, a lot of these people were drug addicts or recovering, that or schizophrenic. I was there because my dad left something there, but I wanted to go to my room, which the nice lady called the room. My dad was talking to this woman outside the door, which was closed. Then the door locks. All I could hear was screaming and crying outside. The knob shook, and I walked over to unlock the door, but my gut told me that if I did, it would not be good. So then a guy began to bang on the door, screaming for me and calling me baby girl. I didn't know what to do when I heard a very loud gunshot, followed by my dad screaming for them to stop shooting due to me being behind the door. He stabbed the woman who had used her keys to lock me in that room, and she did not make it. I was okay, but in the end I just remember a very nice cop opening the door and covering my eyes while they took me outside to an ambulance. R.I.P. Miss Rose, and thank you for saving my life. I am eternally grateful. Homeless man, let's not meet again. A few years ago, I was on holiday in the south of France with my boyfriend, now fiancé, and his family. We stayed in a small village about half an hour inland. One afternoon, me and my boyfriend went for a walk around the village and came across a church cemetery, so we went in to have a look. It wasn't creepy or anything, as it was just daytime, and it was right in the middle of the village, and there were a few cars going past and several people walking around. The cemetery was interesting to us because it was different to a British one, as there were little tombs the size of a garden shed around the edge that were very old and had whole families buried inside. After walking around for a while, we walked up to one of the tombs that had no glass on the door and looked inside. You couldn't see anything odd in there. There was a cross on the wall and a vase that would have had flowers in it. But the smell and the atmosphere changed right outside that tomb. It made us both feel ill, like a sudden sense of dread overtook everything. The air seemed stale. We left quite swiftly, and I felt as if we were being followed after that, until we left the cemetery and got back onto the pavement. I used to live on a large property with a lake, 29 acres of land and heavily forested. I was playing. I was about 11 or 12 at the time, outside by myself, right after the sun had set. I believed this was in the fall, so there were barely any lights to see outside, maybe except for a light on the house about 50 feet away from the swing set that I was on. Behind the swing set were really tall trees. Not many new or sapling trees were anywhere near. I know specifically that there were no trees short enough to have some owl or animal sit in them, because all the trees, pine trees, were mature and taller than my 2-story house. My mom came out to tell me that dinner was almost ready. When she did this, she turned on the outside light on the back porch, illuminating the area so I could see. I was still on the swing set at the time. I start to get up and I turn around, I think to find my flip-flops, when I see 2 bright eyes reflecting the light of the outside light, looking at me from about 20 feet away. The eyes were well above any average human size, about 7.5 feet off of the ground, and they were large. I stopped, stunned and really scared. I was familiar with the woods right behind the swing set, and I knew something unnatural was looking at me. I couldn't see the body, but the eyes looked at me and I tried to get an understanding. And I thought of something massive and humanoid. Bigfoot. Remind you that no animal could have levitated on that spot longer than 5 seconds. Even then, there were no perches or anything there to suspect critters. So to end my experience, I ran inside, locked all the doors, and couldn't think straight for the next couple of days. Let's just say I never played outside on that swing set after sunset ever again. I still think about this, and it chills me. About a year or 2 ago, I was in my room sleeping. I was on my side facing the wall, with the closet in it. I don't even remember waking up. I was just all of a sudden propped up on one arm, still on my side, staring at the closet. I couldn't move either during this event. So as I was stuck staring at the closet door began to open, and I heard whispering coming out from within. I couldn't make out whatever was being said, but when the door was open almost fully, I saw a light grayish, off-white humanoid figure standing in the doorway. I still couldn't move, and then just like that, the figure was gone. The closet door shut, and I was wide awake, laying on my side without any memory of lying back down. It's important, I think, to note that I never felt any fear during this event. I didn't have any kind of emotional response at all. I was just watching what was happening. Any explanations for what it could be, paranormal or not, is appreciated. Also, I've never experienced any kind of sleep paralysis before this or after, and this has never happened again.
I'm renting a house currently with some of my friends, and since we moved in this summer, there was an attic door that had a lock on it from our landlord. Well, me and my friend got curious and decided to try and pick the lock. We ended up getting the combination, and when we went up there, I took 3 photos. One is of the front window, one of the back, and one was of an odd postcard on the ground. I sent a photo to a friend, and without me realizing, there was a very clear face in the window with distinct features, eyes, nose, mouth, and head shape. Prior to this, there had been no experiences in the house besides some odd noises. My housemate claims he saw the same face in a different window today, after we locked the attic back up. I'm scared that we may have woken something, and I honestly want nothing to do with it.
I took my young kids to visit my grandparents' gravesite for the first time. They were really freaked out to learn that dead people were buried underneath all the headstones. The headstone kitty-cornered to my grandparents was for a small boy around 4 or 5. When I noticed the age, I heard a whisper in my ear to talk about the kid. As I said, my kiddos were already really freaked out. I didn't want to add to the experience of learning about dead kids. I heard the whisper 2 or 3 times before we left. When we got into the car, my son said, "Who was that boy standing next to Grandpa? He looked really sick." I instantly had chills and got super emotional knowing that my grandpa was there with him.